There is something about the way a cat moves through a room, the way it pauses in a shaft of moonlight, the way it settles into a space as if claiming what has always been its own, that speaks to a story much older than we might imagine. Tonight, I find myself thinking about these creatures, these elegant companions who share our homes and our lives with such quiet authority, and I wonder how it came to be this way, how these independent beings, these hunters and wanderers, came to rest beside our hearths and curl into our laps. The story begins not in the living rooms and kitchens of today, but in a world that seems almost dreamlike in its distance from us, a world of dust and sun and endless golden grain. If I close my eyes, I can almost see it, the landscape of the ancient Near East, some 9,000 or 10,000 years ago, where the great river valleys cradle the first stirrings of what we might call civilization. The Fertile Crescent, they call it, that arc of a land stretching from the Persian Gulf through Mesopotamia and down along the Mediterranean, where humans first gathered the wild grasses and began to to cultivate them, to transform wandering into settling, and in those settlements, in those first permanent villages built of mud, brick, and stone, something remarkable was happening. Grain was being stored, harvested wheat and barley piled in granaries, creating abundance, creating surplus, creating something that had never existed before in quite this way. But abundance draws more than grateful humans. It draws smaller creatures too, mice and rats who found in these stores of grain a paradise beyond imagining, and the granaries became their kingdoms, their feast halls, unless something else arrived. Imagine those early villages at dusk, the air cooling after the fierce heat of day, smoke rising from cooking fires, the sounds of children and dogs, and the low voices of people settling in for the evening, and there, at the edge of the firelight, moving like liquid shadow, a small form, tawny and striped, eyes catching the glow, the wild cat, Felis silvestris libica, the African wildcat, slipping between the buildings, drawn not by the humans themselves, but by the abundance of prey that the humans had inadvertently created. These cats were hunters, solitary and wary, keeping to themselves in the scrublands and deserts. But here was opportunity. Here was an endless supply of the very creatures they had evolved to catch, and so they came. Generation after generation, not tamed, not domesticated, not yet, but tolerated, the humans who might have chased away other predators, who might have seen them as threats or competitors, instead watched these small hunters with something like appreciation, because the cats were solving a problem, keeping the grain stores safe, protecting the harvest that meant survival. This was not domestication as we might imagine it. No one was reaching out to pet these wild hunters. No one was offering them scraps or inviting them inside. This was something more subtle, a kind of mutual tolerance, a recognition of benefit. The cats hunted. The humans allowed them to hunt. And slowly, so slowly, across hundreds of years, the distance between them began to close. There must have been individual cats, particular animals, who were less fearful than others, whose temperaments were naturally more bold, more curious, who ventured closer to the humans, who perhaps even learned to associate the presence of people with the presence of prey. And these cats, these slightly bolder individuals, they survived, they thrived, they passed their genes on to their kittens. And there must have been individual humans, particular farmers or storekeepers, or children who looked at these small hunters with fascination rather than fear, who began to notice their patterns, their habits, who perhaps left out scraps intentionally, or who simply moved more gently, more quietly, allowing the cats to remain nearby. Generation by generation, grain season after grain season, the relationship shifted, deepened, transformed. The cats who could tolerate human presence had better access to prey. The humans who tolerated cats had cleaner grain stores, and somewhere in that exchange, in that slow dance of mutual benefit, domestication began its quiet work, not through cages or leashes, not through force or capture, but through the simple arithmetic of survival and advantage. The cats were choosing this proximity as much as the humans were choosing to allow it. And in that choice, in that mutual selection, something new was being born into the world, a partnership, however loose and undefined, between two species who each saw in the other not an enemy, not quite a friend, but a useful presence, a beneficial neighbor in the long work of a living. And so the stage was set in those ancient villages, under those ancient stars, for a relationship that would span millennia, that would cross continents, that would transform both species in ways neither could have anticipated, as the wild hunters began their slow, almost imperceptible journey toward the windowsills and armchairs of the modern world. The archaeological record, when we learn to read it, speaks in whispers rather than declarations. It offers us fragments, pieces of bone and pottery, burial sites and refuse heaps. And from these remnants we must reconstruct entire worlds. On the island of Cyprus, in a place called Chilurokambos, archaeologists found something remarkable, a grave, dated to approximately 7,500 years before the present. And in that grave, buried with care alongside a human body, was a cat. Not just any arrangement, not the accidental inclusion of remains, but a deliberate placement. The cat had been laid to rest mere inches from the human, in a position that suggests intention, relationship, perhaps even affection. And this discovery tells us something profound, because Cyprus is an island and cats are not native to islands. Someone brought that cat across the water. Someone carried it on a boat, valued it enough to transport it, to keep it, to eventually bury it with ceremony. This was no wild creature wandering through. This was a companion. This was a relationship that had already formed, already deepened, already become something worth preserving even in death. And if cats were being transported to islands 7,500 years ago, then the relationship must have been developing for centuries before that, millennia perhaps, in those grain villages of the Fertile Crescent, in the slow accumulation of trust and proximity, the genetic studies, when scientists began to analyze the DNA of modern house cats and compare it to their wild relatives, painted a picture of origins. They found that all domestic cats, every tabby and calico and Siamese, trace their lineage back to that same source. Felis sylvestris libica, the African wildcat, still prowling the deserts and scrublands of the Middle East and North Africa. But the genetics revealed something else too, something fascinating about the nature of the cat domestication. Unlike dogs, who show dramatic physical differences from their wolf ancestors, cats changed very little. The skull shape, the body size, the basic architecture of the feline form remained remarkably stable. What changed was not so much the cat's body, but its behavior, its willingness to be near, its tolerance, its temperament. This tells us that humans were not actively breeding cats for specific traits the way they bred dogs for hunting or herding or guarding. The cats were largely selecting themselves, the ones who could abide human presence, who could adapt to the noise and activity of settlements, who could raise their kittens in the margins of human spaces. Those were the ones who prospered, who multiplied, who passed on their slightly more tolerant, slightly more flexible natures. In the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, in the archaeological layers of sites like Jarmo and Jericho, we find evidence of cats among the ruins, not as rarities but as regular presences. Their bones appear in the refuse, suggesting they were part of the daily fabric of life, hunting the mice and rats, living alongside the humans, not quite wild, not quite tame, existing in that liminal space between two worlds. And then, if we follow the timeline forward, if we trace the spread of agriculture and settlement, we come to Egypt, and here the story transforms, deepens, becomes something richer and stranger. Egypt, with its great river, the Nile, bringing life to the desert, creating a ribbon of fertility where grain could grow in abundance, where granaries could be filled to overflowing, where the need for cats as protectors of food stores became not just useful but essential. Egypt, where cats would become not merely tolerated, not merely useful, but sacred. The ancient Egyptians, in their sophisticated understanding of the world, saw in the cat something divine. The goddess Bastet, originally depicted as a fierce lioness, gradually transformed in the artistic record into a more domestic form, a cat-headed woman, graceful and protective, associated with home and fertility, with music and dance, with joy and protection. Cats in Egypt were not simply animals. They were living representations of divine power. They were protectors not just of grain, but of households, of children, of the domestic sphere itself. And the Egyptians treated them accordingly, with reverence, with care, with laws that protected them from harm. To kill a cat in ancient Egypt, even accidentally, could bring severe punishment, death in some cases. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, recorded his observations of Egyptian cat worship with a mixture of fascination and bewilderment. He described how Egyptians would shave their eyebrows in mourning when a household cat died, how they would carry the body to special burial sites, how they would mummify these creatures with the same care given to human dead. And the mummies themselves, thousands upon thousands of cat mummies, have been discovered in Egypt, small wrapped forms, some containing kittens, some adult cats, preserved for eternity. Many were offerings to Bastet, devotional objects, ways of seeking favor from the goddess, but others, buried in household contexts, seemed to be individual pets, specific animals who were loved and mourned and remembered. The art of ancient Egypt shows us cats everywhere. Tomb paintings depict them sitting beneath chairs, collared and decorated, clearly domesticated, clearly valued. Some images show them on hunting expeditions, trained to retrieve birds, working alongside their human companions in the marshes. Other images show them simply as part of daily life, eating fish, playing, existing in the comfortable spaces of home. One famous image from the tomb of Nebamun, a scribe and official, shows a hunting scene, and there, leaping with impossible grace, is a cat catching birds in mid-flight. its body twisted in that characteristic feline flexibility. This cat wears a collar. This cat is doing work for its human, but the artist has captured something more than mere utility. There is beauty here, admiration, perhaps even affection in the careful rendering of the animal's form. The Egyptians bred cats, selectively choosing for temperament and appearance, creating varieties, color patterns, the spotted tabby, the mackerel tabby. The solid colors all began to appear with more frequency, more definition, and while the cats remained physically similar to their wild ancestors, the behavioral distance grew wider. These were animals who sought human company, who lived entirely within human spaces, who had forgotten or never learned the full wildness of their heritage. And from Egypt, the cats began to spread, not through their own wandering, though cats are certainly capable of that, but through human agency, through trade routes and military campaigns, through the slow expansion of civilizations. Phoenician traders sailing the Mediterranean crew, carrying goods from port to port, brought cats aboard their ships, practical measures against the rats that could ruin cargo, but also, perhaps, companions in the long, lonely stretches of sea travel. And when those ships made port in Greece, in Rome, in the far reaches of the Mediterranean world, some cats went ashore, some cats stayed, and new populations established themselves in new lands. The Romans, ever practical, valued cats for the same reasons the early farmers had: pest control, protection of food stores, but they also, in their way, appreciated them as creatures of comfort. Images from Pompeii, that city frozen in volcanic ash, show cats in domestic contexts, mosaics, depicting them with extraordinary detail and care. These were not wild animals feared or merely tolerated. These were household members. A mosaic from the House of the Faun in Pompeii shows a cat catching a bird, the scene rendered with such skill that we can almost see the tension in the cat's muscles, the focus in its eyes, the moment of the hunt, captured forever in tiny tiles of colored stone. Someone commissioned this. Someone wanted this image in their home, wanted to see that feline grace and power every day. In Greece, cats appear in the artistic records somewhat later than in Egypt. But when they do appear, they are shown with similar familiarity, similar integration into daily life. Vase paintings, sculptures, literary references all suggest that by the classical period, cats had become unremarkable in their presence, common enough to need no explanation, simply part of the texture of civilized life. But the spread was not uniform, was not simple. In some places, cats arrived early, in others much later. The island of Britain, for instance, seems to have received its first domestic cats during the Roman occupation, sometime in the first few centuries of the Common Era. Before that, the people of Britain had no cats, relied on other methods, other animals, or simply accepted losses to rodents as inevitable. And in each new place, each new climate and culture, the cats adapted, interbred sometimes with local wild cat populations where they existed, creating new genetic mixtures, new patterns, but always maintaining that core identity, that essential catness that had first drawn humans to tolerate their presence in the granaries of the Fertile Crescent. The behavioral relationship, that delicate balance of independence and affection that characterizes the house cat, was already established by this early period. Cats were not pack animals like dogs, did not form hierarchical relationships with humans as leaders or alphas. Instead, they remained fundamentally solitary in their social structure, willing to coexist, willing to accept food and shelter, willing even to show affection, but always on their own terms, always retaining that core of self-determination. This must have been part of their appeal, this combination of beauty and utility, of warmth and wildness. They could be companions without being servile, could be useful without being dependent, could share a home while remaining somehow apart, mysterious, other, no? The ancient writers, when they mentioned cats, often noted this quality, this sense of the cat as a creature that chooses to stay rather than being compelled to serve. Plutarch, writing in the 1st century, described cats as loving their homes more than their humans, an observation that anyone who has owned a cat might recognize. That sense that the cat has decided to grace you with its presence, has chosen this arrangement and might unchoose it at any moment. And yet, despite this independence, despite this retention of wildness, the bond was real. The evidence of mourning, of deliberate burial, of artistic celebration, all suggest that humans had come to love these creatures, not just value them, not just use them, but genuinely care for them as individuals, as personalities, as beings worthy of affection and memory. By the time the first millennium of the Common Era was well underway, cats had spread throughout the Mediterranean world, into Europe, into Asia, along the trade routes. Each migration carried with it not just the physical animal, but the complex relationship that had been developing for thousands of years, the understanding that cats could be both wild and domestic, both useful and companionable, both independent and affectionate. The foundation had been laid in those ancient grain stores, in those Egyptian temples, in those Roman households, for a relationship that would continue to evolve, to deepen, to spread, until cats would become one of the most successful domesticated species on Earth, living on every continent in nearly every human settlement, choosing, always choosing, to remain. The medieval world, that 1,000-year span stretching from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance, was a complicated time for cats, a time when the relationship that had been building for millennia would be tested, twisted, darkened, and yet somehow endure. In the monasteries of Europe, those islands of learning and literacy in a largely illiterate world, cats were valued, welcomed even. The monks who spent their days copying manuscripts, preserving knowledge in careful script on vellum pages, understood the threat that mice posed to their precious books. A single mouse could destroy months of painstaking work, could gnaw through irreplaceable texts. And so cats walked the cloisters, slept in the scriptoriums where we were fed and sheltered and appreciated. There exists a manuscript from the 9th century, an Irish text, where a monk has written a small poem in the margin, a brief verse about his cat. Pangur ban, white pangur. The monk compares his own work of hunting for meaning in texts to the cat's work of hunting mice. Each of us, he writes, has his own art, and the verse is tender, affectionate, the words of someone who sees the cat not as mere tool, but as companion, as fellow worker in the quiet hours. But beyond the monastery walls, the relationship was becoming more fraught, more complex. The Christian church in medieval Europe had an ambivalent relationship with animals in general, and cats, with their nocturnal habits, their independence, their inscrutable expressions began to attract suspicion. Cats were associated with women, with the domestic sphere, with a certain kind of knowledge that existed outside official channels. The village wise woman, the healer who knew herbs and simples, often kept cats. And as the church began to see witchcraft everywhere, as paranoia about heresy and devil worship grew, cats became entangled in those fears. The black cat especially, with its dark fur seeming to absorb light, became a symbol of evil in some quarters. Associated with witches and demons, with the devil himself, it was said that witches could transform into cats, that Satan appeared as a black cat, that cats were familiars, demonic servants given to those who had made pacts with dark powers, and so began a period of persecution in some parts of Europe, particularly during the height of witch-hunting hysteria from the 13th to the 17th centuries. Cats were killed in large numbers, thrown from towers, burned in bonfires, tortured as proxies for their supposed witch companions. Whole populations were decimated. The consequences of this mass killing were grimly ironic. With fewer cats to control rodent populations, rats multiplied, thrived, spread, and rats carried fleas, and fleas carried plague. The Black Death that swept through Europe in the 14th century, killing perhaps a third of the population, was spread by rats, by the very creatures that cats had been controlling for thousands of years. Some historians suggest that the persecution of cats contributed to the severity of the plague, that the loss of natural predators allowed rat populations to explode, created conditions where disease could spread more easily. Whether this is true or not, the correlation is striking, haunting, a reminder that the systems we disturb, the relationships we break, often have consequences we cannot foresee. But even during this dark period, even as some cats were being killed out of superstition and fear, others were living quiet lives in barns and kitchens, hunting mice, bearing kittens, carrying on the ancient compact. The persecution was real but not universal, not constant. Many people, perhaps most people, still valued their cats, still understood their usefulness, still felt affection for these small hunters who asked so little and gave so much, and on ships, cats remained indispensable. Every vessel that put to sea, every merchant ship and naval frigate and exploration vessel carried cats to control the rats that inevitably infested the holds. Sailors were notoriously superstitious, but their superstitions about cats were generally positive. A ship's cat was good luck, protective, essential, and these seafaring cats, traveling in the hulls of ships from Bristol to Bombay, from Lisbon to the New World, spread feline populations to every corner of the globe. When European ships reached the Americas, cats went with them, establishing populations in places that had never known them. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had no domestic cats, had developed their own relationships with other animals, but cats, arriving with the colonizers, adapted quickly, found new prey, new climates, new niches to fill. In the Islamic world, the relationship with cats had remained largely positive throughout the medieval period. The Prophet Muhammad, according to tradition, loved cats. One famous story tells of how he cut off the sleeve of his robe rather than disturb his cat Muezza, who was sleeping on it. Another tells of a cat who saved the prophet from a poisonous snake and was blessed with the ability to always land on its feet. This cultural appreciation meant that in the Islamic world, from Morocco to Indonesia, cats were welcomed in mosques and homes, were fed and cared for, were seen as clean animals, ritually pure, suitable for the company of the faithful. Cities in the Middle East and North Africa developed large populations of free-roaming cats, fed by the community, living in the streets and alleyways, neither fully wild nor fully owned, existing in that characteristic feline space between worlds. In Asia, cats had arrived along the trade routes, the Silk Road bringing not just spices and silk, but animals and ideas. In China, cats appear in the historical record from around 2,000 years ago, valued for pest control in the granaries and silk stores. In Japan, cats arrived from China and Korea, and by the medieval period, the Heian period, they were being kept by the aristocracy, pampered and decorated, subjects of art and poetry. Japanese cats were often kept indoors, especially valuable breeding females, protected and prized, and the Japanese artistic tradition, with its attention to natural detail, its love of asymmetry and imperfection, found endless inspiration in feline forms. Cats appear in scrolls and screens, in woodblock prints, sometimes realistic, sometimes fantastical, transformed into supernatural beings, bakaneko, cats with magical powers. But even these supernatural cats were not necessarily evil. They were complex, tricksters, shapeshifters, reflecting the real cat's ability to seem domesticated one moment and utterly wild the next. The working relationship, cats as controllers of vermin, remained central throughout all of this, in the granaries of medieval Europe and Asia, in the warehouses of port cities, in the holds of ships, in the storage rooms of great houses. Cats did the work they had been doing for thousands of years, hunting, killing, protecting human food stores from the creatures that would consume them, but they also, increasingly, served another function, one that had always been there, but was becoming more pronounced, more acknowledged. They provided comfort, companionship, the pleasure of their presence, the softness of fur underhand, the rumbling vibration of purring, the grace of their movements, the mystery of their moods. All of this became valued not for utility, but for its own sake. Wealthy households, those who could afford to feed animals who did no work, began to keep cats purely as pets. Breeding programs, informal at first, began to select for certain traits, certain colors, certain temperaments. The cats of Siam, now Thailand, developed distinctive pointed coloration and blue eyes. The cats of Persia developed long flowing coats. The cats of the Isle of Man developed a genetic mutation that shortened or eliminated their tails. These breeds were not yet standardized, not yet formalized into the rigid categories that would come later, but the diversity was increasing. The appearance of cats was changing through human selection for the first time since domestication began. And this suggested a shift in the relationship. Cats were no longer just tolerated hunters, just useful workers. They were becoming aesthetic objects, status symbols, companions chosen for their beauty as much as their utility. Yet even as breeding began, even as some cats lived lives of luxury in noble households, the vast majority of cats remained working animals, living semi-feral lives in barns and alleys, breeding freely, maintaining the genetic diversity and vigor that would serve the species well. These cats, the common cats, the mixed-breed mousers, were the true inheritors of the ancient compact, still hunting, still choosing to live near humans for the abundance it provided, still raising their kittens in the margins of human civilization. The folklore and superstition surrounding cats grew richer and stranger during this period. In Celtic land, cats were associated with the fairy realm, the other world, mysterious, magical, not quite to be trusted. In Slavic countries, certain markings were thought to bring luck or ward off evil. In Scandinavia, the goddess Freya was said to ride in a chariot pulled by cats, massive cats, powerful enough to draw a divine being. These stories, these beliefs, reflected the cat's liminal nature, the way it existed between wild and tame, between useful and ornamental, between mundane and mysterious. A cat sleeping by the fire was as familiar as bread, but a cat's eyes glowing in darkness, a cat's eerie yowl in the night, these were things that spoke to older fears, older knowings, reminded humans that this creature, however domesticated it seemed, retained something of the wild, the medieval agricultural calendar, the rhythm of seasons and harvests, structured the cat's role. In summer, when grain was harvested and stored, cats were essential, their population allowed to expand to meet the need. In winter, when food was scarce for everyone, fewer cats survived. Natural selection culling the populations. Those who were particularly good hunters, particularly bold in scrounging, particularly favored by humans who would share scraps, those were the ones who made it through to spring. This yearly cycle, repeated across centuries, shaped the cat population, kept them adapted to their role, prevented them from becoming too domesticated, too dependent. They needed to be able to hunt, to survive on their own if necessary, because winter did not care about human sentiment, only about survival. And yet, even in this harsh world, even in times of scarcity and superstition, the bond persisted. People named their cats, mourned them when they died, told stories about particular animals with particular personalities. The historical record, sparse as it is for the lives of common people, still contains glimpses of this affection, wills that mention cats, court records of disputes over cat ownership, small markers of lives lived together. The medieval world was transforming, slowly, imperceptibly from within, moving toward something new, and cats, adapting as they had always adapted, were moving with it, their populations spreading, their genetics diversifying, their relationship with humans deepening in some ways and remaining anciently constant in others, neither fully wild nor fully tame, neither servant nor master, simply present, simply there, sharing the human world while remaining fundamentally themselves. The Renaissance, that flowering of art and learning and rediscovery, brought with it a new way of seeing the world, a new curiosity about natural things. Artists began to observe cats with the same attention they gave to human anatomy, to the play of light on fabric, to the perfect rendering of reality. Leonardo da Vinci filled pages of his notebooks with cat sketches, quick studies of cats stretching, playing, fighting, sleeping. His hand captured the essential catness of these creatures, the way their spines curved, the alertness in their ears, the relaxed power in their limbs. He was not just drawing cats. He was studying them, trying to understand the mechanics of their movement, the architecture of their grace. And in paintings of the period, cats began to appear with increasing frequency. sometimes symbolically representing domesticity or independence or mystery, but often simply as part of the scene, part of the texture of daily life. A cat in the corner of a domestic interior, a cat sleeping on a windowsill in a portrait. These were not statements about cats, but acknowledgments of their presence, their ordinariness, their integration into human spaces. The printing press, invented in the 15th century, allowed for the spread of knowledge in ways previously unimaginable. Books about natural history began to appear, catalogs of animals, descriptions of their habits and natures, and cats were included, discussed, categorized. Though the understanding was often mixed with folklore and error, still it represented an attempt to know them, to understand them through observation rather than superstition. The age of exploration, those centuries when European ships crossed every ocean, mapped every coast, brought cats to every corner of the globe, Australia, New Zealand, remote islands in the Pacific and Atlantic, all received populations of cats, sometimes deliberately introduced, sometimes escaping from ships, sometimes left behind when ships departed. In these new environments where cats often thrived, especially on islands where native species had evolved without mammalian predators, the ecological impact was sometimes catastrophic. Bird populations decimated, small mammals driven to extinction. The cat's hunting prowess, so valued in granaries and ships, became a destructive force when unleashed on ecosystems that had no evolutionary experience of such predators. This tension between the cat as useful companion and the cat as invasive predator would become increasingly apparent in later centuries. But in the age of exploration itself, the primary concern was practical. Ships needed cats, colonies needed cats, and cats, adaptable as ever, made themselves at home in climates from tropical to Arctic, in landscapes from desert to rainforest. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and classification, brought new attention to the diversity of cat breeds. Scientists like Carolus Linnaeus, who created the system of taxonomic classification still used today, gave the domestic cat its scientific name, Felis catus, distinguishing it from its wild relatives while acknowledging their kinship. And breeders, particularly in England, began to take a more systematic approach to creating distinct varieties. The concept of a breed, as we understand it today, a group of animals with standardized appearance and documented lineage, was developing, first with horses and dogs, but increasingly with cats as well. The Victorian era, that age of empire and industry and domestic refinement, transformed the human relationship with cats in profound ways. Queen Victoria herself kept cats, and what the Queen did, society followed. Cats became fashionable, desirable, objects of refined taste. The first formal cat show was held at the Crystal Palace in London in 1871, organized by Harrison Weir, an artist and cat enthusiast who wanted to elevate the status of cats through competition and standardization. Hundreds of cats were exhibited, judged on their conformity to breed standards, their beauty, their temperament, and thousands of people came to see them, to admire them, to marvel at the variety that could exist within a single species. This was a turning point. Cats were no longer just animals who happened to live with humans. They were becoming projects, subjects of deliberate creation. Their appearance was being shaped through selective breedings more intensively than ever before. Persian cats with their flat faces and flowing coats, Siamese cats with their distinctive points and blue eyes, British short hairs with their round faces and plush fur, Maine Coons with their size and tufted ears. All of these breeds were standardized, refined, promoted. The cat fancy, as it came to be called, spread from England to America and Europe. Cat clubs were formed, breed registries established, rules and standards written and debated. The cats themselves, once they had been street animals, barn animals, workers. Now some of them lived lives of extraordinary privilege, bred for show, pampered and groomed, worth substantial sums of money. But even as this fancy world developed, even as cats became status symbols and show animals, the majority of cats remained what they had always been: mousers and companions, mixed-breed animals living ordinary lives in ordinary homes. The genetic diversity of these common cats, their vigor and adaptability, remained the foundation on which the fancy breeds were built. The 19th century also brought new understanding of cats as biological organisms, the development of a veterinary medicine, the growing scientific study of animal behavior and physiology began to reveal the cat's true nature. They were obligate carnivores, requiring meat in their diet in ways that dogs, more omnivorous, did not. Their digestive systems, their metabolisms, their nutritional needs, all were distinct, specific, requiring understanding if cats were to thrive in captivity. The discovery of the role of cats in disease transmission, particularly toxoplasmosis, brought new concerns. Cats became subjects of public health discussions, their large populations in cities sometimes seen as problems to be managed. Yet their value in controlling rats and mice, particularly in warehouses and food storage facilities, remained undeniable. The relationship was being negotiated in new ways, through science and regulation, rather than folklore and tradition. The 20th century, that era of unprecedented change, brought cats fully into the modern world. Urbanization accelerated, and cats adapted. Cities filled with apartment buildings where outdoor space was limited, and cats, unlike dogs, could live contentedly indoors, could use litter boxes, could exercise through play rather than walks. This made them ideal urban pets, perfect companions for the modern working person living in small spaces. Commercial cat food appeared, first in the early 1900s, crude by modern standards but representing a shift. No longer did cats have to hunt or scavenge or rely on table scraps. They could be fed prepared food, formulated, eventually, with their specific nutritional needs in mind. This changed the practical nature of cat keeping, made it easier, more convenient, more accessible to people who lived far from barns and granaries. Veterinary care improved dramatically. Vaccines were developed for common feline diseases. Spaying and neutering became routine, extending cats' lives and preventing unwanted litters. The average lifespan of a pet cat increased from perhaps 5 or 6 years at the beginning of the century to 12 or 15 or even 20 years by its end. This meant deeper bonds, longer relationships, more investment in individual animals. The understanding of cat behavior also deepened. Scientists began to study how cats think, how they communicate, what their social structures look like. Researchers discovered that cats have complex vocalizations, different meows for different purposes, developed specifically to communicate with humans. Their purr, once thought to signal only contentment, was found to also occur during stress or pain, possibly a self-soothing mechanism. Their body language, the position of ears and tail and whiskers, was decoded, catalogued, explained, and people began to understand that cats, while not pack animals, were not the solitary creatures they had been assumed to be. They formed social bonds with humans and with other cats. They could be trained, though their independence meant they were less motivated by pleasing humans than dogs were. They played throughout their lives, retaining kitten-like behaviors into adulthood, a sign of domestication, of neoteny, of perpetual youth. The late 20th century saw an explosion in the cat population of the developed world. In the United States alone, cat ownership surpassed dog ownership. Cats became the most popular pet, their numbers in the tens of millions. Their images filled the early internet, cat videos and photos becoming a defining feature of online culture. The bond between humans and cats, ancient as it was, found new expression in digital sharing, in the celebration of individual cats' personalities and quirks. Yet this population boom brought challenges. Feral cat colonies in cities, abandoned pets breeding freely, creating populations of cats living wild but dependent on human refuse, animal shelters filled with unwanted cats, millions euthanized every year because homes could not be found for them. The same adaptability that had made cats successful, their ability to survive and reproduce in human-altered landscapes, now created problems of overpopulation, and the ecological concerns, first recognized on islands centuries before, became more urgent. Studies showed the devastating impact of free-roaming cats on wildlife, particularly birds and small mammals. Even well-fed pet cats retained their hunting instinct, killed for sport rather than food. The tension between cat lovers and conservationists grew sharp, passionate, unresolved. The relationship had become complicated, layered, no longer the simple compact of the ancient granaries. Cats were beloved companions, family members, sources of comfort and joy. But they were also environmental concerns, public health considerations, subjects of legislation and debate. The intimacy had deepened even as the complications multiplied. And yet, through all of this, the essential nature of the cat remained, still independent, still mysterious, still balancing wildness and domesticity in that characteristic way. A cat sleeping in a sunbeam in a modern apartment, curled on a cushion in a climate-controlled room, fed from a bowl, wearing a collar. That cat retained something of its wild ancestors, something untamed, something that could never be fully possessed or controlled, only invited, only welcomed, only loved on its own terms. The story of domestication, when we really look at it, is not a story of conquest or submission. It is something stranger, more mutual, more mysterious. Think about what happened in those ancient grain stores. Neither species planned it. Neither species understood what was beginning. The cats came for the mice. The humans tolerated the cats. And in that simple exchange, that basic arithmetic of advantage, something profound began to unfold. Because what is domestication, really, if not a kind of dance, a negotiation between two forms of being? The wolf became the dog through transformation, through change so deep that body and mind and behavior were all reshaped. But the cat came to us almost unchanged, slipped into our world while remaining fundamentally itself. This tells us something about the nature of the feline, about that quality of independence that defines them. They domesticated themselves, not through submission, but through choice, through a kind of pragmatic opportunism that recognized benefit without surrendering autonomy. And perhaps this is why the bond feels different, why loving a cat is not like loving a dog. A dog gives itself completely, loves with abandon, with devotion, with a kind of wholehearted surrender. But a cat offers something more conditional, more measured, and somehow, in its very conditionality, more precious. When a cat chooses to sit with you, to purr against your hand, to sleep curled in your lap, it is choosing, in that moment, your company over solitude, your warmth over independence. And there is something deeply satisfying in being chosen, in being deemed worthy, in being granted access to that guarded affection. The purr itself, that strange vibration that arises from somewhere deep in the chest, is one of nature's mysteries. Scientists have studied it, measured its frequency, discovered that it falls in a range that may actually promote healing, that may strengthen bones, reduce pain, lower blood pressure. A cat purring on your chest might be offering more than comfort, might be offering something like medicine, ancient and wordless and true. And the eyes, those vertical pupils that expand in darkness, that contract to slits in bright light, giving cats their ability to see in conditions where humans are blind, those eyes that seem to look through you, past you, into some light realm we cannot access. They remind us that this creature, however domesticated, however familiar, perceives the world differently than we do, lives in a sensory landscape we can only imagine. Their hearing, detecting frequencies far above human range, means they exist in a world of sounds we never hear. Their sense of smell, their Jacobson's organ that lets them taste scent, opens dimensions of experience we lack. They are living in our homes, but in a different reality, a parallel world that overlaps with ours, but never quite aligns. And perhaps this is part of the fascination, the enduring mystery. We share our lives with these creatures, and yet can never fully know them, can never fully understand what it is to be them. They remain other, remain wild in some essential way, even as they sleep on our beds and eat from our hands. The scientists who study cat cognition have discovered remarkable things. Cats recognize their names. Though they may choose not to respond, they understand pointing, can follow human gaze, can learn to manipulate humans to get what they want. They are intelligent, but their intelligence is directed toward their own ends, not toward pleasing us, not toward obedience, but toward survival, toward comfort, toward the satisfaction of their own desires. This is not a lesser intelligence, just a different one, shaped by evolution for a solitary hunting lifestyle, for independence rather than cooperation, and when we learn to appreciate it on its own terms, to stop expecting cats to be like dogs, to accept them as they are, the relationship deepens, becomes richer, more real. The bond between cat and human, 10,000 years in the making, is built on this foundation of the mutual benefit and mutual respect. We provide food, shelter, safety, warmth. They provide pest control, companionship, comfort, beauty. But more than that, they provide a connection to something wild, something untamed, something that chose to stay but could choose to leave. In our modern world, so controlled, so domesticated, so cut off from nature, there is something deeply satisfying about living with an animal that bridges that gap, that brings a little wildness into our homes, that reminds us that not everything can be tamed, not everything should be. The cat on the windowsill, watching birds, tail twitching with predatory focus, is the same as the wild cat on the edge of that ancient village, the same hunting instinct, the same fierce concentration. Thousands of years have passed. Civilizations have risen and fallen. The world has transformed beyond recognition, but the cat remains essentially magnificently itself. And in that continuity, that connection to the deep past, there is something profound we are touching when we stroke a cat's fur. The same creature that Egyptian priests revered, that medieval monks sheltered, that sailors carried across uncharted seas, the same and yet always individual, always unique, each cat its own being, its own personality, its own irreplaceable presence. The cats who share our lives today, whether purebred show animals or alley rescues, whether pampered house cats or working barn cats, all carry that ancient heritage. All participate in that long relationship, and they carry it forward into whatever future awaits, adapting as they have always adapted, surviving as they have always survived, choosing us again and again across the generations. This is the gift they offer, not just their practical skills, not just their beauty or their comfort, but their very presence, their embodiment of the wild made familiar, the foreign made close, the independent choosing to stay. They teach us, if we are willing to learn, about boundaries and respect, about patience and acceptance, about loving without possessing, about sharing space without demanding surrender. The relationship is not simple, never has been. It contains darkness, the persecution of the Middle Ages, the ecological damage of invasive populations, the millions of unwanted animals dying in shelters. But it also contains profound beauty, profound connection, profound meaning, and it endures, changes, evolves, but endures. Tonight, thinking about these creatures, about their long journey from the wild edges of human settlements to the centers of our homes and hearts, I find myself filled with a kind of quiet wonder at the strangeness of it, the improbability, the grace that two species so different could find their way to each other, could build something lasting across millennia, could create a bond that neither dominates nor submits, but simply is. This seems almost miraculous, almost beyond explanation. And yet here we are, here they are, cats in houses all over the world, curled in favorite spots, hunting dust motes in shafts of light, purring in laps, living their mysterious cat lives in the intimate proximity of human lives, neither fully wild nor fully tame, neither servant nor master, simply companion, simply present, simply here. The night is deep now, the house is quiet. Somewhere a cat is sleeping, dreaming perhaps of ancient hunts, ancient territories, ancient choices, the same dreams its ancestors dreamed 10,000 years ago, the same essential catness, unchanged, enduring, eternal in its particular way. And in the morning, the cat will wake, will stretch with that perfect feline extension, will walk to its bowl or to the door, will move through its territory with that characteristic grace, will live another day of the long story, the endless story, the story that began in grain stores beside rivers we can barely imagine, and continues here, now, in this moment, in this quiet. The partnership holds 10,000 years and counting. The grain needs protecting, the mice need catching, the hearth needs warming, and the cat, wild and domestic, independent and affectionate, mysterious and familiar, continues its work, continues its presence, continues its choice to stay, to remain, to be with us, but never quite of us, forever itself, forever cat, forever walking that line between two worlds, perfectly balanced, perfectly adapted, perfectly, imperfectly, beautifully, here. And so the story rests for now. In this stillness, in this quiet appreciation of the long arc of connection, the domestication that was never quite domestication, the wildness that was never quite wild, the relationship that defies easy categorization, that refuses simple explanation, that simply is and has been and continues to be. The cats are sleeping, the world turns, the ancient compact holds, and in the space between human and feline, between wild and tame, between choice and necessity, something rare persists, something precious, something worth celebrating in the deep hours when thought drifts soft and wonder settles gentle, like a cat finding its place and curling, quiet, into rest. There is a quietness that settles over certain thoughts, a particular kind of stillness that comes when considering the hidden architecture of everything around us. And tonight, I find myself drawn into that contemplative space where the invisible becomes almost tangible, where the building blocks of existence reveal themselves not through noise or spectacle, but through patient observation and gentle wonder. Chemistry is everywhere, in the air moving through an open window, in the pages of an old book, in the glass that holds water, in the water itself, and yet it remains largely unseen, working its quiet transformations beneath the surface of our daily awareness. It is the language that matter uses to speak to itself, the grammar of atoms and molecules, the syntax of bonds forming and breaking in an endless, elegant conversation. I imagine a laboratory late in the evening, not the bright, bustling space of daytime work, but rather a place where shadows lengthen across wooden benches, where glass vessels catch the last amber light, where everything has settled into a profound hush. In such a space, one might sense the presence of something ancient and fundamental, the same forces that have been orchestrating the dance of particles since the universe began, still present, still active, still weaving their intricate patterns. The periodic table hangs on a wall somewhere in my mind's eye. That elegant arrangement of elements, each one a distinct character in the grand story of matter. Hydrogen, the simplest, the first, born in the heart of the universe itself. Carbon, the backbone of the life, the connector, the builder of infinite complexity. Oxygen, the breath, the burner, the partner in so many essential reactions. These are not mere abstractions, not just symbols in boxes arranged in rows. They are the fundamental vocabulary of existence, the letters from which every material thing is written. The iron in ancient meteorites and the iron in our blood share the same essential nature. The carbon in a diamond and the carbon in a pencil lead differ only in arrangement, in the pattern of their connections, in the geometry of their bonds. There is something deeply calming about this realization that beneath all the variety and complexity of the material world, beneath the countless forms and textures and colors, there exists a finite collection of elemental building blocks, 94 of them occurring naturally, each with its own character, its own way of interacting with others, and from this relatively small alphabet, the universe composes everything we see and touch and experience. Tonight, I find myself drawn into this realm not as a student facing an examination, not as someone seeking to master formulas or memorize reactions, but rather as someone standing at the edge of a vast, quiet ocean, content to observe the patterns in the waves, to notice how water moves, how light plays across its surface, how everything connects in subtle, beautiful ways. The story of chemistry is really the story of transformation, of how one thing becomes another through the rearrangement of atoms. It is the story of fire turning wood to ash and heat and light, of iron slowly joining with oxygen to form rust, of grapes fermenting into wine, of flour and water and yeast rising into bread. These transformations have accompanied humanity since our earliest days, and long before anyone understood the underlying mechanisms, people observed, experimented, and learned to work with these mysterious changes. There is an old alchemical symbol, a snake eating its own tail, representing cycles and transformation and the unity of all matter. The alchemists, those medieval and Renaissance seekers, were wrong about many things. They never succeeded in turning lead into gold, never found the universal elixir, and yet they were not entirely misguided. They understood intuitively that matter could be transformed, that hidden relationships existed between different substances, that patient observation and careful experiment could reveal profound truths. In many ways, they were the ancestors of modern chemistry, their smoky laboratories and cryptic manuscripts forming a bridge between ancient philosophy and systematic science. They developed techniques for distillation, for separation, for purification. They created specialized vessels and tools. They kept meticulous records, even if those records were sometimes obscured by mystical language and symbolic imagery. And underneath all their spiritual seeking and their quest for transmutation, they were engaging with something real and profound, the actual behavior of matter, the genuine transformations that occur when substances combine or separate, when heat is applied or removed, when solutions crystallize or vapors condense. I can almost smell the strange mixture of aromas that must have filled those old laboratories, the sulfurous tang, the sharp bite of acids, the sweet, heavy scent of certain metals, the acrid smoke of burning materials, each smell a clue, each observation a piece of a larger puzzle, slowly, over centuries, being assembled into something approaching understanding. But even now, even with our modern knowledge and sophisticated instruments, there remains something mysterious and wonderful about chemistry, something that invites quiet contemplation rather than mere memorization. It asks us to imagine scales we cannot directly perceive, to think about particles too small to see, about reactions happening in infinitesimal fractions of a second, about forces that hold atoms together with invisible yet powerful bonds. And so tonight, I invite myself deeper into this realm, not rushing, not straining, but allowing the story to unfold at its own pace, like a chemical reaction proceeding according to its own inherent timing, like a crystal slowly growing in a saturated solution, adding layer upon layer, building structure from solution, creating order from apparent chaos. The story begins long before there were laboratories or textbooks, long before anyone had conceived of atoms or elements in the way we understand them now. It begins with fire, with that first flame captured and tended, with humanity's earliest encounter with deliberate transformation. Imagine the scene. Tens of thousands of years ago, a group of people gathered around a fire, watching as wood, solid and substantial, becomes heat and light and smoke and a small pile of ash. The wood is gone, transformed into something else entirely. This must have seemed like magic, like a doorway into forces beyond ordinary comprehension, and in a sense, it was. Fire became humanity's first chemical laboratory. In its heat, clay hardened into pottery, giving people vessels to store and carry and cook. Certain rocks, when subjected to intense heat, yielded metals, copper first, gleaming and malleable, then bronze when copper was combined with tin, opening an entire era of human development. The people who discovered these processes didn't understand oxidation or reduction, didn't know about the rearrangement of atomic bonds, but they learned through patient trial and observation. They learned which ores yielded which metals, which temperatures were needed, which techniques produced the best results. This was chemistry, practical and empirical, passed down through generations as closely guarded knowledge. In the Nile Valley, the ancient Egyptians developed sophisticated chemical practices. They created pigments of stunning permanence, blues and greens and golds that still shine on tomb walls thousands of years later. They developed techniques for extracting and purifying metals, for making glass, for creating cosmetics and medicines, for the elaborate process of mummification. The word chemistry itself, some scholars believe, derives from the ancient Egyptian word for their land, chem or kemet, meaning black earth, the dark fertile soil left by the Nile's flooding. This connection feels appropriate, chemistry emerging from the earth, from the transformation of materials, from the patient work of hands, learning to shape and change the substances of the world. The Egyptians created natron, a mixture of sodium compounds, which they used in mummification and in glass making. They made faience, that brilliant blue-green glazed ceramic. They extracted oils and essences through primitive distillation. They ground minerals into powders, mixed compounds, observed reactions, all without understanding the underlying principles, yet achieving remarkable results through careful attention and accumulated experience. Meanwhile, in different parts of the world, other civilizations were conducting their own chemical explorations. In China, artisans were creating porcelain of extraordinary refinement, the right clay, the right temperature, the right glaze, all had to come together in precise harmony. They were also experimenting with what would eventually become gunpowder, mixing sulfur and charcoal and saltpeter, observing the dramatic reactions when these substances combined. The Chinese developed intricate processes for extracting metals from ores. They created bronze vessels of incredible artistry and technical sophistication. They fermented grains into alcohol, pickled vegetables, made vinegar. All of these processes involved chemical transformations, though the language to describe them would not exist for many centuries. In the ancient Mediterranean world, Greek philosophers began to ask fundamental questions about the nature of matter. What is everything made of? they wondered. What underlying substance or substances compose the vast variety of things we observe? Thales of Miletus, living around 600 years before the Common Era, proposed that water was the fundamental substance, the origin of all things. This seems quaint now, but it represented a crucial shift in thinking, an attempt to find unity beneath diversity, to identify fundamental principles rather than simply cataloging observations. Empedocles proposed that 4 elements, earth, water, air, and fire, combined in different proportions to create everything in the material world. These elements were thought to be moved by 2 forces, love, which brought them together, and strife, which drove them apart. It's a poetic framework mixing physics and metaphysics, but it represented an attempt to understand transformation and change. Democritus, whose name means chosen of the people, proposed something remarkably prescient. He suggested that if you kept dividing matter, cutting it into smaller and smaller pieces, you would eventually reach a point where no further division was possible. These ultimate particles he called atomos, meaning indivisible. He imagined these atoms as tiny, solid, eternal particles, differing in shape and size, and that the properties of different materials arose from the shapes and arrangements of their component atoms. This was an extraordinary insight, arrived at through pure reasoning rather than experiment. Democritus couldn't see atoms, couldn't prove their existence, but his intuition led him toward a truth that wouldn't be confirmed for more than 2,000 years. His contemporaries largely ignored or rejected his ideas, preferring the more elaborate and exoplanetary frameworks of other philosophers. And yet his vision of atoms moving through void, combining and separating, contained the seed of modern atomic theory. Aristotle, perhaps the most influential of ancient philosophers, modified and extended the 4-element theory, adding a 5th element, the quintessence or ether, thought to compose the heavenly bodies. He proposed that substances could transform from one to another through changes in their qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry, lead and gold. In this view were different combinations of the same fundamental matter, suggesting that transformation between them might be possible. This Aristotelian framework would dominate Western thought about matter for nearly 2,000 years. It was elegant, comprehensive, and completely wrong in most of its specifics, and yet it served as a foundation for countless investigations and experiments. It gave people a language to discuss material change, a framework within which to organize observations. The practical arts continued to advance throughout the classical period and into the medieval era. Metallurgists refined their techniques, learning to work with iron, to create steel, to alloy different metals for different purposes. Glassmakers achieved new levels of clarity and color. Dyers discovered new ways to extract and fix colors from plants and minerals and certain sea creatures. The production of Tyrian purple, that royal color extracted from thousands of sea snails, represented both chemistry and economics. The process was complex, labor-intensive, and the result was a dye of exceptional quality and permanence. The exact mechanisms of how the chemical compounds in the snail's secretions bonded with fabric fibers was unknown, but the process worked, and that was sufficient. Fermentation remained mysterious and almost magical. Bread rising, grapes becoming wine, honey becoming mead. milk becoming cheese. These transformations happened in their own time, seemingly of their own accord, guided by invisible agents that wouldn't be identified as microorganisms for many more centuries. People developed elaborate rituals and precise methods, knowing that certain conditions favored successful fermentation while others led to spoilage. In the medieval Islamic world, chemistry advanced significantly through the work of scholars like Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in Latin as Geber, working in the 8th and 9th centuries. He emphasized careful experimentation and detailed observation. He described processes like distillation and sublimation with precision. He worked with various chemical substances, acids and alkalis, salts and metals. Jabir wrote extensively, though many works attributed to him may have been written by later scholars using his name. His texts described laboratory equipment and techniques, methods for purifying substances, procedures for combining materials. Much of his work was wrapped in symbolic and mystical language, following the tradition of keeping chemical knowledge hidden from the uninitiated. But beneath the symbolism lay genuine experimental work and practical knowledge. The development of distillation technology represented a major advance. The alembic, a specially designed vessel for separating substances by heating and condensing, allowed for the purification of liquids, the concentration of essences, the separation of alcohol from fermented beverages. In skilled hands, distillation could isolate specific components from complex mixtures, producing substances of unprecedented purity. Arabic scholars preserved and translated ancient Greek texts on natural philosophy, adding their own observations and innovations. They coined new terms, many of which have passed into modern chemistry: alcohol, alkali, elixir, alembic, all derived from Arabic. This linguistic legacy reflects the central role that Islamic scholars played in developing chemical knowledge during Europe's medieval period. The quest for the philosopher's stone became a central preoccupation of medieval and Renaissance alchemy. This legendary substance was imagined to have the power to transform base metals into gold, to create an elixir of life, to perfect matter itself. The search for it drove countless experiments, motivated scholars to spend years in their laboratories, mixing, heating, observing, recording. Was this search misguided? Perhaps. Gold cannot be made from lead through chemical means. Atoms of one element cannot be transformed into atoms of another element through the processes available to alchemists. And yet, the search itself generated real knowledge. Alchemists developed new equipment and techniques. They discovered new substances and documented their properties. They learned about acids and bases, about crystallization and precipitation, about the behavior of materials under different conditions. Paracelsus, working in the early 16th century, challenged many traditional alchemical and medical ideas. He emphasized the importance of chemistry for medicine, proposing that the body functioned through chemical processes and that diseases should be treated with chemical remedies rather than the traditional herbal preparations. He introduced the use of specific minerals and chemical compounds as medicines, mercury and antimony and sulfur compounds. His ideas were controversial and often overstated, but he helped shift alchemy toward a more medical and practical orientation. He insisted on the importance of experiment over authority, declaring that knowledge came from observation and testing rather than from ancient texts. This empirical emphasis, combined with his focus on practical applications, helped lay groundwork for chemistry's emergence as a distinct discipline. The alchemists worked in spaces filled with furnaces and vessels, retorts and crucibles. Their laboratories must have been extraordinary places, filled with strange smells and colored smokes, with substances bubbling and crystallizing, with the constant work of heating and cooling, mixing and separating. The knowledge they accumulated was often recorded in coded language and allegorical imagery, making it difficult for outsiders to understand. Yet within the alchemical community, this symbolic language conveyed real information about procedures and substances. Gradually, through the 17th century, a transformation began to occur in how people approached the study of matter. The mystical and symbolic framework of alchemy started to give way to something more systematic, more openly shared, more focused on understanding rather than simply achieving practical results. Robert Boyle, working in England and Ireland in the 1600s, embodied the shift. He conducted careful experiments with gases, with combustion, with the properties of air. He developed an improved air pump, allowing him to create partial vacuums and observe how substances behaved in the absence of air. He found that a flame would not burn without air, that animals could not survive without air, that sound did not travel in a vacuum. Boyle published his findings openly, writing in clear language rather than alchemical codes. He emphasized reproducibility, the idea that experiments should be described clearly enough that others could repeat them and verify the results. This seems obvious now, but it represented a profound change in how knowledge about matter was shared and validated. He questioned the Aristotelian four elements, arguing instead that elements should be defined as the simplest substances into which matter could be divided, substances that could not be broken down further. This was a crucial conceptual shift, moving away from philosophical speculation toward operational definitions based on experiment. In his book, The Skeptical Chymist, published in 1661, Boyle challenged both the four-element theory of the ancient Greeks and the three-principle theory popular among alchemists: sulfur, mercury, and salt. He argued for a more empirical approach, observing what actually happened when substances were heated or mixed or separated, rather than imposing preconceived frameworks. The air itself became an object of intense investigation. What was this invisible substance that surrounded everything, that was essential for fire and for life? Different investigators began to realize that air was not a single pure element, but rather a mixture of different substances. Joseph Black, working in Scotland in the 1700s, investigated what he called fixed air, what we now know as carbon dioxide. He showed that this gas was produced when certain carbonates were heated, and that it was the same gas produced by respiration and by burning. He demonstrated that it was denser than ordinary air, that it extinguished flames, that it could be absorbed by alkaline solutions. Black's work was meticulous. He weighed substances before and after chemical reactions, measuring the changes with precision. This quantitative approach, applying careful measurement to chemical processes, would become increasingly important, transforming chemistry from a primarily qualitative science into one based on exact measurements and mathematical relationships. Joseph Priestley, an English clergyman and natural philosopher, conducted extensive experiments with different kinds of air, or gases, as they would come to be called. He isolated and studied what he called dephlogisticated air, a gas in which flames burned brighter and mice lived longer. This was oxygen, though Priestley himself never fully abandoned the phlogiston theory to understand its true nature. The phlogiston theory held that combustible materials contained a substance called phlogiston that was released during burning. When something burned completely, it had released all its phlogiston. This theory explained many observations why metals gained weight when they burned. They were supposedly losing light phlogiston and retaining heavy residue, but it ultimately proved to be wrong. An elegant idea that didn't match reality. In France, Antoine Lavoisier was conducting his own careful experiments, weighing substances before and after reactions with unprecedented precision. He heated mercury in a closed container, carefully measuring the air and the mercury and the red powder that formed. He noticed that when mercury was heated, it combined with part of the air, and the remaining air would not support combustion or life. When he collected the red powder and heated it more intensely, the mercury returned, and the gas released was the same as Priestley's dephlogisticated air. Lavoisier realized that combustion was not about releasing phlogiston, but about combining with this component of air. He named it oxygen, from Greek words meaning acid former, because he believed it was essential for forming acids. Lavoisier's work in the 1780s and 90s established the law of conservation of mass. The principle that in chemical reactions matter is neither created nor destroyed, but only transformed. Total mass before a reaction equals total mass after. This seems simple, but it was revolutionary, providing a foundation for understanding chemical change through careful measurement and balance. He developed a new system for naming chemical compounds, working with other French chemists to create a logical nomenclature based on the elements that composed each substance. This system replaced the confused multitude of traditional names: oil of vitriol and butter of antimony and lunar caustic, with names that indicated composition: sulfuric acid and antimony chloride and silver nitrate. This new language made chemistry more accessible, more logical. It allowed chemists to communicate precisely about substances and reactions, to see patterns and relationships that had been obscured by traditional naming. It represented chemistry becoming a true science with systematic methods and clear terminology. Lavoisier also compiled a list of elements, substances that could not be decomposed by any known means. His list included true elements like oxygen and nitrogen and hydrogen, but also some substances that would later be found to be compounds. His approach was sound even if his list was imperfect. Elements were defined operationally by what they were observed to be, not by philosophical preconceptions. Tragically, Lavoisier was guillotined during the French Revolution in 1794, a victim of political upheaval. His contributions to chemistry were deemed irrelevant by revolutionary tribunals, focused on his former role as a tax collector. A colleague reportedly said that it took only a moment to cut off his head. But France might not produce another like it in a century. The loss was profound, a brilliant mind silenced at the height of his productivity. Yet his work survived him. The new chemistry he had helped establish continued to develop. Other investigators built on his foundations, exploring the properties of elements, studying how they combined, measuring the proportions in which substances reacted. John Dalton, an English schoolteacher with a deep curiosity about the natural world, proposed in the early 1800s that each element consisted of identical atoms with a specific weight, and that compounds formed when atoms of different elements combined in definite, simple ratios, 1 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3. This atomic theory revived and refined the ancient ideas of Democritus, but now grounded them in experimental observation and measurement. Dalton assigned relative weights to the atoms of different elements, using hydrogen as the standard with a weight of 1. His values weren't always accurate, but the principle was sound. Each element had atoms of characteristic mass, and these masses determined the proportions in which elements combined. He explained why a given compound always had the same composition, why water was always 2 parts hydrogen to 1 part oxygen by volume, why carbon dioxide was always carbon combined with oxygen in a specific ratio, because compounds were formed by atoms combining in definite whole number proportions. Dalton was colorblind, which he investigated scientifically, writing the first detailed description of the condition. He was quiet, methodical, keeping detailed weather records every day for more than 50 years. He approached chemistry with the same patient observational spirit, accumulating data, looking for pattern, building theory from careful measurement. As the 19th century progressed, more elements were discovered and isolated. Humphrey Davy in England used electricity to decompose compounds, isolating sodium and potassium by passing electric current through molten salts. These reactive metals had never been seen in pure form before. Sodium, soft enough to cut with a knife, shining silver, reacting violently with water. Potassium, even more reactive, bursting into flame when exposed to water. Davy also isolated calcium, magnesium, barium, strontium, demonstrating that electricity could break apart compounds that resisted other methods of decomposition. This electrochemical approach opened new possibilities, revealing elements that had been locked in compounds, showing that chemical bonds could be understood in terms of electrical forces. Jöns Jacob Berzelius in Sweden determined the atomic weights of many elements with remarkable accuracy. He analyzed thousands of compounds, carefully measuring their compositions. He introduced the system of using letter symbols for elements: H for hydrogen, O for oxygen, C for carbon. This notation made chemical formulas much simpler to write and understand. Water became H2O, showing its composition clearly and concisely. Berzelius also coined important chemical terms still used today. He distinguished between organic chemistry, the study of carbon-containing compounds associated with living things, and inorganic chemistry, the study of other substances. This division would prove somewhat artificial, but it reflected observed differences in how these compounds behaved. The discovery of new elements continued throughout the century. Some were found in rare minerals, extracted through painstaking chemical procedures. Others were detected through new analytical techniques, like spectroscopy, which revealed the presence of elements by the characteristic colors they produced when heated in a flame. Cesium and rubidium were discovered this way in the 1860s, identified by the unique lines in their emission spectra before anyone had isolated macroscopic samples. Helium was first detected in the Sun's spectrum before being found on Earth. Its name derives from Helios, the Greek sun god. Patterns began to emerge as more elements were characterized. Certain elements seemed to have similar properties. Lithium, sodium, and potassium, all soft reactive metals, chlorine, bromine, and iodine, all reactive nonmetals that formed similar compounds. Investigators began arranging elements in various schemes, trying to find order in the growing list. Dmitry Mendeleev, a Russian chemist with wild hair and an unconventional spirit, made the breakthrough in 1869. He arranged elements by atomic weight, but left gaps where properties suggested elements should be. He predicted the properties of these missing elements with remarkable accuracy. When gallium was discovered a few years later, it matched his predictions almost exactly. His periodic table revealed that properties repeated at regular intervals. Chemical behavior was not random, but followed patterns based on atomic weight and structure. Elements in the same column had similar properties. The table had holes, suggesting undiscovered elements. It had an elegant logic that hinted at deeper underlying order. Mendeleev's table was not immediately accepted, but as predicted elements were discovered and found to match his descriptions, it became clearer that he had found something fundamental. The periodic table became the organizing framework for all of chemistry, a map of the elements showing relationships and patterns. Yet even as Mendeleev's table brought order to the elements, deeper questions remained. Why did elements have these specific properties? Why did the pattern repeat? What determined an element's chemical behavior? The answers would come from discoveries about the internal structure of atoms themselves. In 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen discovered mysterious rays that could pass through paper and wood and even flesh, revealing the bones within. He called them X-rays, marking their unknown nature. These rays emerged when fast-moving electrons struck metal targets, though neither electrons nor their role were yet understood. The following year, Henri Becquerel in France discovered that uranium compounds emitted their own penetrating radiation without any external stimulation. Photographic plates wrapped in black paper were fogged when placed near uranium salts. Something was radiating from the uranium itself, constantly, inexplicably. Marie Curie, working with her husband Pierre in a cold, converted shed in Paris, investigated this phenomenon with intense determination. She coined the term radioactivity and set about measuring it in various substances. She found that the intensity of radiation was proportional to the amount of uranium present, suggesting it was an atomic property, not a molecular one, working through tons of pitch-blende ore. The Curies painstakingly isolated two new elements, both more radioactive than uranium. They named one polonium, after Marie's native Poland, and the other radium, from the Latin word for ray. The work was physically exhausting, stirring boiling solutions with iron rods nearly as tall as Marie herself, breathing fumes, exposed to radiation they didn't yet understand as dangerous. Radium glowed in the dark with a soft blue-green light, its radiation continuing endlessly, seemingly violating the conservation of energy. Where was this energy coming from? The implications were staggering. The atom was not indivisible after all, not a solid, unchanging sphere as Dalton had imagined, but something more complex, something that could transform, releasing energy in the process. Ernest Rutherford, a New Zealander working in England and Canada, investigated radioactive emissions, identifying two types: alpha particles, which could be stopped by paper, and beta particles, which penetrated further. A third type, gamma rays, similar to X-rays but more energetic, was identified by others. Rutherford showed that alpha particles were helium atoms stripped of their electrons, and that when radioactive elements emitted these particles, they transformed into different elements. Uranium slowly became thorium, which became another element, and so on down a chain of transformations. The alchemist's dream of transmutation was real after all, not achieved through chemical processes, but occurring spontaneously in certain elements. In 1911, Rutherford proposed a revolutionary model of atomic structure based on experiments where alpha particles were fired at thin gold foil. Most passed through, but occasionally one bounced back at a sharp angle. He concluded that atoms were mostly empty space, with a tiny dense nucleus at the center containing most of the mass, and electrons orbiting this nucleus like planets around a sun. This nuclear model explained many observations, but it created new puzzles. According to classical physics, orbiting electrons should continuously radiate energy and spiral into the nucleus in a fraction of a second. Atoms should be unstable, yet they persisted. Something was missing from the theory. Niels Bohr, a Danish physicist working with Rutherford, proposed that electrons could only exist in certain specific orbits, quantum states with discrete energies. Electrons could jump from one orbit to another, absorbing or emitting energy in precise amounts, but they could not exist between these allowed states. This quantum model explained the spectral lines of hydrogen beautifully. The specific wavelengths of light emitted corresponded exactly to the energy difference between allowed orbits. It was strange and unprecedented, imposing discrete jumps where classical physics predicted continuous change. But it matched experimental observations with uncanny precision. The understanding deepened through the 1920s and 30s. Louis de Broglie proposed that electrons had wave-like properties as well as particle-like properties. Werner Heisenberg and Erwin Schrödinger developed mathematical frameworks for quantum mechanics, describing electrons not as particles in definite orbits, but as wave functions, probability distributions showing where electrons were likely to be found. In this quantum world, electrons occupied orbitals, three-dimensional regions around the nucleus. The periodic table's pattern finally made sense. Elements in the same column had similar properties because they had the same number of electrons in their outermost orbitals. Chemical behavior was determined by these outer electrons, their arrangement, their availability for sharing or transferring to other atoms. The chemical bond itself came into focus. Gilbert Lewis proposed that atoms shared pairs of electrons to form covalent bonds, creating stable arrangements. This sharing explained why hydrogen formed H2 molecules, why oxygen formed O2, why water was H2O with the oxygen atom sharing electrons with two hydrogen atoms. Linus Pauling extended these ideas, describing how orbitals could blend or hybridize, explaining molecular shapes and bond strengths. He introduced the concept of electronegativity, a measure of how strongly an atom attracts electrons, allowing predictions about whether bonds would be ionic, with electrons transferred from one atom to another, or covalent, with electrons shared, or something in between. The 20th century saw chemistry expand in every direction. Organic chemistry grew enormously as chemists learned to synthesize complex molecules, creating dyes and drugs and plastics and countless other materials. The German chemical industry became dominant in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, producing synthetic indigo that replaced natural dye sources, creating aspirin and other pharmaceuticals, developing processes for industrial-scale production. Fritz Haber developed a process for synthesizing ammonia from nitrogen and hydrogen, crucial for producing fertilizers and explosives. The process required high temperatures and pressures. With iron catalysts facilitating the reaction, it transformed agriculture, allowing the production of nitrogen fertilizers without relying on natural nitrate deposits, supporting a vast increase in food production, though also enabling modern warfare through abundant explosives. The same chemical knowledge that created fertilizers and medicines also produced poison gases used in World War I, chlorine and phosgene and mustard gas, drifting across battlefields, causing terrible suffering. Chemistry's power was neutral, capable of healing or harming, depending on human choices. This duality would become even more apparent as the century progressed. Polymers emerged as a major field. Leo Baekeland created the first fully synthetic plastic, Bakelite, in 1907, opening an era of materials that didn't exist in nature. Wallace Carruthers at DuPont developed nylon, the first fully synthetic fiber, strong enough to replace silk in parachutes, versatile enough to become ubiquitous in clothing and countless other applications. The understanding of chemical kinetics advanced. How fast do reactions proceed? What factors affect reaction rates, temperature, concentration, catalysts? Each variable could be studied, measured, related to the molecular processes underlying visible changes. Arrhenius developed equations relating temperature to reaction rate, explaining why chemical processes speed up when heated. Analytical chemistry became increasingly sophisticated. Instruments could detect and measure substances in tiny concentrations, spectroscopy in various forms, infrared, ultraviolet, nuclear magnetic resonance, each revealing different aspects of molecular structure. Mass spectrometry could determine molecular weights and fragment patterns, providing detailed structural information. Chromatography allowed separation of complex mixtures, components moving at different rates through a medium, emerging separately where they could be collected and analyzed. This technique became essential for analyzing everything from blood samples to environmental pollutants, from flavoring compounds to drugs. The electron microscope revealed structures at scales impossible with light. Viruses became visible. The detailed architecture of crystals could be examined. Later, scanning tunneling microscopes would allow imaging of individual atoms, making visible what Democritus could only imagine: those ultimate particles arranged in precise geometric patterns. Biochemistry emerged as a discipline, studying the chemical processes within living organisms. Enzymes were revealed as protein catalysts of extraordinary specificity and efficiency. The structure of proteins was gradually worked out, long chains of amino acids folding into precise three-dimensional shapes, their function depending on their form. The discovery of DNA's structure by Watson and Crick in 1953, building on Rosalind Franklin's X-ray crystallography data, revealed the molecular basis of heredity. The double helix with its complementary base pairs explained how genetic information was stored and replicated. all of life's diversity ultimately came down to chemistry, to sequences of nucleotides encoding sequences of amino acids that folded into proteins that carried out the functions of life. Chemistry had come full circle, in a sense, from ancient attempts to understand life's essence through material transformation, through centuries of accumulated practical knowledge and theoretical development, to a molecular understanding of life itself, the mechanisms of inheritance, of metabolism, of cellular function, all revealed as chemistry, as the orchestrated interactions of molecules following the same principles that governed simpler reactions in flasks and beakers. Environmental chemistry emerged as pressing concerns. DDT and other persistent pesticides lead in gasoline and paint, acid rain from industrial emissions, the thinning ozone layer. Chemistry had created many of these problems, but chemistry also provided the understanding needed to address them, to measure pollutants, to understand their effects, to develop alternatives. The development of computational chemistry allowed prediction of molecular properties and reaction pathways. Powerful computers could solve the quantum mechanical equations approximately, modeling molecular structures and behaviors. Drugs could be designed on computers, tested virtually before any synthesis was attempted. Materials could be optimized. Reactions could be understood in unprecedented detail. As the 20th century ended and the 21st began, chemistry had become deeply integrated with other sciences, materials science, nanotechnology, biochemistry, environmental science. The boundaries blurred as problems required interdisciplinary approaches. Yet the fundamental questions remained chemical. How do atoms and molecules interact? What determines structure and reactivity? How can we harness these principles to create desired outcomes? And beneath all the sophistication, all the advanced instruments and computational models, the core principles remain those discovered through centuries of patient observation, conservation of mass and energy, the periodic properties of elements, the quantum nature of matter, the relationship between structure and function. These principles, discovered through countless experiments in laboratories, quiet and bustling, in universities and industries, by individuals driven by curiosity or practical need, formed the foundation of our material world. The story of chemistry is not finished. New materials are being created, new drugs discovered, new processes developed. But perhaps there is value in pausing here, in this quiet moment, to contemplate what has been learned, to appreciate the journey from fire to quantum mechanics, from gold-seeking alchemists to genome-editing biochemists, all asking fundamentally similar questions about the nature of matter and transformation. The deeper one looks into chemistry, the more it reveals about the fundamental nature of reality itself. Every solid object, every liquid, every gas is composed of particles in constant motion, vibrating, rotating, moving through space. Even when everything appears perfectly still, at room temperature, the molecules in the air are moving at speeds of hundreds of meters per second, colliding billions of times per second. Yet we perceive only stillness and silence. The water in a glass appears calm, but its molecules are in ceaseless agitation, hydrogen bonds forming and breaking in femtoseconds, a time scale so brief that light travels only a fraction of a hair's width. This hidden dynamism exists everywhere, in the wood of a table, in the fabric of clothing, in the cells of our bodies. Nothing is truly at rest, Everything participates in an endless molecular dance, following the laws of thermodynamics, tending toward equilibrium, yet capable of remarkable organization and order. Consider a snowflake, each one unique, yet each one following the same basic hexagonal symmetry. The shape emerges from the way water molecules bond to each other, from the angles determined by the arrangement of electrons around oxygen and hydrogen atoms, from quantum mechanics to ice crystal geometry, from the invisible to the visible. The connection is direct and beautiful. Or consider the colors we see. The blue of the sky results from how air molecules scatter sunlight, preferentially scattering shorter blue wavelengths. The red of a rose comes from pigment molecules that absorb certain wavelengths and reflect others. The green of leaves, chlorophyll molecules capturing photons and using their energy to drive chemical reactions that build sugars from carbon dioxide and water. Color itself is chemistry made visible. Every hue and shade arising from molecular structure, from the arrangement of atoms and the behavior of electrons, the sunset's orange and red, the ocean's varied blues, the infinite gradations of autumn leaves, all chemical phenomena, all expressions of how matter interacts with light. The energy that powers nearly everything on Earth's surface comes ultimately from nuclear reactions in the sun's core. Hydrogen fusing into helium, releasing energy that travels as light across space, to be captured by plants, to be stored in chemical bonds, to flow through food chains and ecosystems, chemistry and physics intertwined, matter and energy in constant exchange. Even our thoughts and feelings have a chemical dimension. Neurotransmitters crossing synapses, hormones traveling through bloodstreams, proteins folding and unfolding in response to signals. The experience of consciousness emerges from chemistry, from the coordinated activity of molecules in the vast network of the brain. This doesn't diminish the mystery, but rather deepens it. How does chemistry become experience? How does matter become aware of itself? The question brings us back to ancient philosophical puzzles, but now with molecular specificity. We know which molecules are involved in memory formation, which ones create feelings of pleasure or pain, which ones regulate sleep and wakefulness. Yet the gap between knowing the mechanism and understanding the experience remains. Chemistry gives us the how, but not quite the why. Perhaps there is something profound in chemistry's insistence on transformation. Nothing is permanent. Everything is in flux. Iron rusts, diamonds can burn, even gold slowly exchanges atoms with its surroundings. The substance persists, but the particular atoms come and go, replaced gradually over time. Our own bodies demonstrate this. The calcium in our bones is not the same calcium that was there years ago. The carbon in our cells has been cycled through the atmosphere, through plants, through other organisms. We are temporary arrangements of atoms borrowed from the environment, assembled into the pattern of a human body, maintained through constant chemical work, eventually to be returned and redistributed. This view is both humbling and connecting. We are not separate from the material world, but continuous with it. The iron in our blood was forged in ancient stars. The oxygen we breathe was produced by photosynthesis. The water in our cells has cycled through clouds and rivers and oceans. We are made of the world, and we will return to it. Atoms persisting, patterns dissolving and reforming. Chemistry also teaches us about emergence. how properties arise that cannot be predicted from components alone. Hydrogen and oxygen, both gases, combine to form liquid water with properties utterly unlike either element, sodium, a metal that reacts violently with water, and chlorine, a poisonous gas, combine to form table salt, essential for life. The whole is genuinely different from the sum of parts. This emergence happens at every level. Atoms form molecules with new properties. Molecules form cells with the property of life. Cells form organisms with consciousness. At each level, new possibilities emerge, new behaviors, new phenomena that could not exist at simpler levels of organization, and yet the fundamental rules remain the same. The quantum mechanics governing electrons in atoms also governs electrons in molecules, in cells, in brains. The laws of thermodynamics apply to chemical reactions in beakers and to the complex metabolism of living organisms. Unity underlies diversity. Simple rules generate endless complexity. There is something almost musical about chemistry. Harmonic relationships in the periodic table, resonance structures in molecules, the rhythms of oscillating reactions, systems seeking equilibrium, sometimes overshooting and oscillating before settling, like waves gradually damping, like sounds fading into silence. The Belousov's Jabotinsky reaction demonstrates this beautifully, a mixture of chemicals that oscillates between colors, red and blue, back and forth, in waves spreading through the solution, pattern and rhythm emerging from chemistry alone, no life required, just the right combination of molecules and conditions, creating order from chaos, temporarily, before eventually running down toward equilibrium. All chemistry moves toward equilibrium, that state of maximum entropy, of uniform distribution, of no more potential for change, and yet we exist far from equilibrium, maintained by constant flows of energy and matter, eating, breathing, burning fuel, dissipating heat, creating local order at the expense of increasing disorder elsewhere. Life itself is chemistry kept persistently out of equilibrium. A cell dies when it reaches equilibrium with its surroundings. Life requires difference, concentration gradients, energy flows, the ability to harness these differences to do work, to maintain organization, to repair damage, to grow and reproduce. This is the deep insight of thermodynamics. Order requires energy. Complexity requires work. The intricate beauty of living things, the precise folding of proteins, the replication of DNA, all sustained by energy flowing from high-quality sources like sunlight toward the low-quality heat of the universe. We are all participants in this vast flow, temporary eddies in the stream. And so, as these thoughts settle like dust motes finding stillness, as the images of laboratories and reactions and glowing elements fade into softer focus, there remains a quiet sense of connection to something vast and ancient. The same forces that combined hydrogen and helium in the first stars, that forged heavier elements in supernovae, that condensed matter into planets, that sparked the first self-replicating molecules. These forces continue their work in every breath, in every moment. Chemistry asks nothing of us but observation. It proceeds whether we understand it or not. Rust forms on iron, sugar dissolves in water, wood burns to ash. The universe goes on with its transformations, indifferent to our understanding, yet open to our investigation. There is comfort in this, in the reliability of natural law, in the consistency of chemical behavior. Water always freezes at the same temperature, under the same conditions. Hydrogen and oxygen always combine in the same proportions. The periodic table's pattern holds true everywhere we can observe, on Earth, in meteorites, in the spectra of distant stars. This universality suggests something profound, that the rules governing matter are not local, not arbitrary, but fundamental to the structure of reality itself. Chemistry would work the same way anywhere in the universe. The same elements would have the same properties. The same bonds would form. The same reactions would proceed. Somewhere, perhaps, on a planet circling a distant star, water might be flowing. Carbon-based molecules might be organizing into life. Chemistry working out its patterns in conditions we can barely imagine. The details would differ, but the underlying principles would be the same. This thought connects us to the cosmos, makes us less alone in the vastness. The story of chemistry is ultimately a story about change and continuity, about transformation within constancy. Elements persist even as they combine and recombine. Atoms remain even as molecules form and break apart. The fundamental particles endure through countless rearrangements. We ourselves are part of this story, not observers standing outside, but participants fully embedded in the chemical world. Our bodies are chemistry. Our thoughts emerge from chemistry. Our awareness, in this moment, reflecting on chemistry, is itself a chemical phenomenon. Neurons firing, neurotransmitters crossing gaps, electrical signals propagating through networks of cells. And yet knowing this doesn't diminish the wonder. If anything, it deepens it. The fact that matter, arranged in particular ways, following chemical and physical laws, can become aware, can ponder its own existence, can ask questions about the nature of reality. This seems almost miraculous, yet it is simply what chemistry does. Given enough time, enough complexity, enough energy flowing through the system, perhaps that is the deepest lesson, that there is no clear boundary between the living and the non-living, between the conscious and the unconscious, between spirit and matter, only different levels of organization, different degrees of complexity, all following the same fundamental rules, all part of the same continuous reality. The alchemists sought to perfect matter, to find the philosopher's stone, to achieve transmutation. In a sense, we are the transmutation they sought. We are matter that has become conscious of itself, atoms organized into patterns that can think and feel and wonder, the base metal of simple elements transformed into the gold of awareness. This transformation required no magical catalyst, no secret formula, only time and the patient working out of chemical and physical law. Billions of years of stars forming and exploding, of planets coalescing and evolving, of molecules combining and competing and gradually organizing into life, of nervous systems developing and consciousness emerging. And now, in this moment, chemistry continues. Oxygen is being transported through bloodstreams. Carbon dioxide is being released. Molecules are binding to receptors. Enzymes are catalyzing reactions. The vast coordinated chemistry of life proceeds, mostly unconscious, mostly automatic, requiring no deliberate thought or attention. The night deepens, or perhaps it is simply the thoughts that deepen, settling like sediment in a still water. The questions remain, but they feel less urgent now, less demanding of answers, content simply to exist, to be held gently in awareness. chemistry will continue its patient work, in laboratory and in nature, in industry and in living cells, transforming substances, revealing new possibilities, creating materials that never existed before, solving problems, sometimes creating new ones, always exploring the space of what is possible within the constraints of physical law. But for now, there is just this quiet contemplation, this sense of connection to the material world, this appreciation for the elegant simplicity underlying endless complexity. The periodic table hangs in memory, elements arranged in their rows and columns, each one a thread in the vast tapestry of matter, each one playing its part in the ongoing story. The story has no end, only pauses, only moments of rest between transformations, and in this pause, in this stillness, there is everything and nothing, just the gentle awareness of being, of existing as a temporary pattern in the flow, of participating in chemistry's ancient dance. The words fade now, like the last light fading from the sky, like heat gradually dissipating into the surroundings, like a reaction approaching equilibrium. The story settles into silence, into the deep quiet, from which all things emerge and to which all things return. And there is only this moment, this breath, this gentle letting go. I imagine a place beyond the edges of waking thought, a realm where the borders between earth and sky dissolve into something older, something that breathes with the rhythm of countless ages. There is a quality to certain stories that makes them feel less like tales and more like returning, as if the mind already knows these shapes, these names, these faces that peer through the mist of time with eyes both human and infinite. Tonight, the journey leads toward the peaks of mountains that touch the ceiling of the world, toward rivers that have flowed since before memory began to keep its records, toward a tradition so vast and layered that it seems to contain multitudes within multitudes, like nesting dolls carved from starlight and devotion. The gods of the Hindu tradition are not simple. They are not singular. They are oceans of meaning, forests of symbolism, skies filled with stories that overlap and interweave until the boundary between one tale and another becomes as permeable as morning fog. Imagine standing at the edge of a great river at dawn, the Ganges perhaps, or the Yamuna, waters that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, that have carried the prayers of billions, that flow with a patience that makes a human urgency seem like the flutter of a moth's wing. The mist rises from the surface, and in that mist, shapes begin to form, not quite solid, not quite dream. They are presences, with forms that shift according to the needs of those who seek them, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce, always vast, beyond the capacity of any single story to contain. This is not a tradition that asks for simplicity. It does not reduce the complexity of existence into neat categories or singular truths. Instead, it sprawls, it proliferates, it embraces paradox with the ease of a river accepting tributaries, each one adding to the whole without diminishing what came before. There are gods here who create and destroy in the same breath, goddesses who nurture and wage war with equal devotion, divine children who play games that determine the fate of worlds, and sages whose thoughts become the architecture of reality itself. To speak of these beings is to enter a landscape where time moves differently, where a single lifetime might span aeons, where a moment of meditation might contain the birth and death of universes, where the playful and the profound dance together without contradiction, the oldest texts speak in a language that feels like it was designed to be chanted, to be sung, to vibrate in the chest and the skull until meaning arrives not through logic alone, but through resonance, through the body's understanding of rhythm and repetition. These are the Vedas, composed in Sanskrit, a tongue so precise that each syllable carries weight, carries power, carries layers of meaning that unfold like lotus petals in slow motion. And from these ancient hymns, these ritual formulas, these cosmic speculations, emerge the figures who will populate a tradition so rich that even after thousands of years, new interpretations continue to blossom like flowers in an endless spring. There is Brahma, the creator, often depicted with four faces looking in all directions, seeing all of time and space simultaneously, holding the Vedas themselves in his hands, embodying the principle of emergence, of manifestation, of the unfolding of potential into form. There is Vishnu, the preserver, who reclines on the cosmic serpent between cycles of creation, who descends into the world in avatar after avatar, taking form as fish, as tortoise, as boar, as half-lion, as dwarf, as warrior prince, as cowherd god, each incarnation a response to a specific crisis, a specific need, a specific imbalance that requires divine intervention. And there is Shiva, the destroyer and transformer, the ascetic meditating on Mount Kailash, the wild dancer whose movements create and dissolve reality, the Lord of contradictions who is both the ultimate renunciate and the devoted husband, both the terrible and the auspicious, holding in his being the necessary truth that destruction and creation are not opposites, but partners in the cosmic dance. These three form what later tradition will call the Trimurti, the triple form, the three aspects of the one divine principle, though even this framework is only one way of understanding, one lens among many through which to glimpse the infinite, because alongside these great gods are their consorts, their feminine counterparts who are not subordinate but essential, not secondary but foundational. Saraswati with her Veena, goddess of learning and music and the flowing of knowledge, Lakshmi with her lotuses, goddess of prosperity and grace and the abundance that nourishes life, Parvati in her many forms, from gentle mountain daughter to fierce warrior goddess, embodying Shakti, the divine feminine power that animates all existence. The landscape of this tradition includes countless other beings. Ganesha with his elephant head, remover of obstacles, lord of beginnings, patron of arts and sciences, Hanuman the monkey god, whose devotion knows no limits, whose strength serves righteousness, whose leap across the ocean becomes a symbol of faith transcending impossible distances. There are the planetary deities, the river goddesses, the sacred mountains personified, the principles of dawn and night given faces and names, the very elements themselves worshipped as divine presences, until the entire cosmos becomes populated with consciousness, with intention, with personality. This is a worldview that sees divinity not as distant or abstract, but as intimately woven into the fabric of existence, present in the stone of the temple and the water of the well, in the cow that gives milk and the tree that offers shade, in the guru who teaches and the parent who nurtures, in the beggar on the street who might be a god in disguise, testing the devotion and generosity of mortals, The stories told about these beings are not simple moral fables. They are complex narratives filled with surprising turns, with ethical ambiguities, with moments of profound beauty and shocking violence, with love that transcends death and jealousy that sparks cosmic wars. And as the mist continues to rise from that river at dawn, as the shapes within it become clearer and then dissolve again into formlessness, the invitation is simply to witness, to allow these stories and these beings to unfold at their own pace, to trust that understanding will come not through forcing or grasping, but through patient attention, through the slow accumulation of images and ideas that will gradually form their own constellation of meaning. The journey has just begun, and there are depths yet to explore. The roots reach back further than almost any other living tradition, back into a time when history and mythology had not yet separated into distinct categories, when the line between what was remembered and what was imagined remained beautifully blurred. In the river valleys of the Indian subcontinent, in a time scholars now place somewhere around 1,500 years before the Common Era, perhaps earlier, perhaps much earlier, groups of people were composing hymns, creating rituals, asking questions about the nature of existence with a sophistication that still startles those who encounter these texts for the first time. These were the Vedic people, and their world was one of fire altars and soma offerings, of priests who memorized thousands of verses with such precision that the oral tradition preserved exact syllables across countless generations, creating a living library carried in human memory. The oldest layer, the Rig Veda, contains 10 mandalas, 10 circles of hymns, and within these circles are prayers addressed to forces of nature that are already being personified, already being understood as conscious beings with preferences and personalities. There is Agni, the fire god, present in every hearth and every ritual flame, the messenger between human and divine realms, the witness to every sacrifice, the mouth of the gods that consumes offerings and transforms them into sacred smoke, rising toward heaven. There is Indra, the storm god, the warrior deity who drinks soma and grows mighty, who wields the thunderbolt, who battles the serpent demon Vritra to release the waters, to bring rain, to make the world fertile and habitable. His exploits recounted in hymn after hymn with a vigor and celebration that makes the ancient poetry pulse with energy. There is Varuna, keeper of cosmic order, guardian of Rita, the principle of natural law and moral truth, he who knows all secrets, who sees through darkness, whose 1,000 eyes observe every action, every thought, every deviation from the path of righteousness. And there is Surya, the sun, and Ushas, the dawn, and Vayu, the wind, and the Ashvins, the divine horsemen who race across the sky, each deity embodying some aspect of the natural world while also transcending it, possessing stories and relationships that make them more than mere personifications. But even in these earliest texts, there are hints of something more, questions that probe beneath the surface of polytheistic worship, hymns that ask where these gods came from, whether they too had an origin, whether there might be something prior even to them. The Nasadya Sukta, the hymn of creation, poses questions rather than providing answers. It describes a time before being and non-being existed, before death or immortality, before day or night, a primordial state of potential from which everything emerged, and it ends by wondering whether even the highest gods know the secret of creation, or whether that knowledge belongs to something beyond naming. This philosophical questioning would only deepen over time. But in the Vedic period, the focus remained largely on ritual, on the proper performance of sacrifices, on maintaining the relationship between human and divine through offerings, through praise, through the careful pronunciation of sacred syllables. The priests who performed these rituals were the Brahmins, a class of specialists who devoted their lives to mastering the complex procedures, the exact intonations, the precise gestures required to make the sacrifices efficacious. They were the keepers of sacred knowledge, the intermediaries between worlds. And the rituals themselves could be elaborate affairs, lasting for days, sometimes for years, involving multiple priests, hundreds of verses, offerings of grain and ghee and animals, the construction of temporary fire, altars with geometrically precise dimensions, the whole enterprise designed to maintain cosmic order, to ensure the prosperity of kings, to secure blessings for the community. Within this ritual framework, the gods were present as honored guests, as powerful allies, as beings who could be pleased or offended, who had their favorite offerings and their preferred modes of address, who might grant sons or wealth or victory in battle if properly propitiated. But the Vedic corpus is vast, and it evolved over centuries, and gradually the focus began to shift from external ritual to internal understanding, from the mechanics of sacrifice to the meaning behind the symbols. The later portions of the Vedas, the Brahmanas, contained detailed explanations of ritual procedures, but they also included stories, mythological narratives that explained why certain practices existed, that connected ritual actions to cosmic events, that made the sacrifice itself a reenactment of creation. And then came the Aranyakas, the forest texts, composed by those who had withdrawn from village life, who meditated in wilderness places, who sought understanding through contemplation rather than through elaborate ceremony, and finally, the Upanishads, perhaps the most revolutionary texts in the entire tradition, dialogues between teachers and students, between sages and kings, between seekers and those who had found, conversations that turned the attention inward, that asked not about the gods out there, but about the divine principle within. The Upanishads introduced concepts that would transform the entire tradition, the idea of Brahman, the ultimate reality, the ground of all being, infinite, eternal, beyond all qualities, yet the source of all qualities, not a god among gods, but the reality that underlies gods and humans and all of existence, and the idea of Atman, the inner self, the consciousness that witnesses all experience, that persists through all changes, that is, in the most radical formulation, identical with Brahman, the famous equation tattvam asi, that thou art, collapsing the distinction between the individual soul and the cosmic absolute. These were not ideas that replaced the gods, rather they recontextualized them. The deities of the Vedic pantheon remained important, remained objects of worship and devotion, but they were now understood as manifestations, as particular expressions of the one ultimate reality, as faces that the formless shows to those who need form. This philosophical development occurred gradually, over centuries, in different regions with different emphases. There was no single moment of revelation, no founder declaring a new doctrine. Instead, there was an organic evolution, a slow maturation of ideas through countless conversations, countless meditations, countless moments of insight accumulated and refined. And during this same long period, the society itself was developing the structures that would characterize it for millennia. The Varna system, the division into Brahmins, who performed rituals, Kshatriyas, who governed and fought, Vaishyas, who engaged in commerce and agriculture, and Shudras, who provided service, each group with its own duties, its own dharma, its own role in maintaining the cosmic and social order. The concept of dharma itself became central, this word that means law, duty, righteousness, cosmic order, the way things should be. It was dharma that held everything together, that gave each being its proper place, its proper function, and the gods were understood as guardians and exemplars of dharma, as beings whose actions demonstrated what it meant to live in accordance with cosmic law. But dharma was not simple, not uniform. It varied according to one's station in life, one's age, one's circumstances. What was dharma for a warrior might be adharma for a priest. What was appropriate in youth might be forbidden in old age. The tradition embraced this complexity, this contextual ethics that refused to reduce moral life to simple commandments. Alongside dharma came the ideas of karma and samsara, the understanding that actions have consequences that extend beyond a single lifetime, that the soul transmigrates from body to body, experiencing the fruits of past deeds, creating through each action the conditions for future existence. This was not originally a Vedic concept. It appeared in the Upanishads without clear precedent, and it fundamentally altered the religious landscape, because now the question was not just how to please the gods or perform correct rituals, but how to escape the cycle altogether, how to achieve moksha, liberation, release from the wheel of birth and death. Different paths emerged, different methods proposed for achieving this liberation. The path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga, through direct realization of one's identity with Brahman. The path of meditation and withdrawal, leading to the development of what would become yoga in its classical forms. And the path of action, Karma Yoga, performing one's duty without attachment to results. And woven through all of this, the gods continued to evolve, to accumulate new attributes, new stories, new forms of worship. Indra, the great warrior of the Vedas, began to fade somewhat in importance, while other deities grew in stature and complexity. Rudra, a fierce deity mentioned in the Vedas, associated with storms and healing, with the wilderness and the terrifying aspects of nature, gradually transformed into Shiva, acquiring attributes and myths that made him one of the great gods of the tradition. No longer just a dangerous force to be appeased, but a complex figure embodying contradiction, the ascetic and the householder, the destroyer and the transformer, the lord of yoga and the cosmic dancer. And Vishnu, who in the Vedas was a relatively minor solar deity, known mainly for taking 3 steps to measure the universe, began to grow in significance, to accumulate a mythology of preservation and intervention, of descending into the world to restore balance whenever dharma declined. The idea of the avatar, the descent, the divine incarnation, became particularly associated with Vishnu, and stories began to be told of his various forms. The fish who saved Manu from the flood, the tortoise who supported the mountain used to churn the cosmic ocean, the boar who rescued the earth from the depths, each myth addressing some crisis, some threat to the cosmic order that required divine response. These were not yet the fully developed narratives that would appear in later texts, but the seeds were being planted. The mythological imagination was at work, connecting different stories, harmonizing different traditions, creating ever more elaborate frameworks for understanding the divine. And the goddess, who had been present in the Vedas in various forms, as Ushas, the dawn, as Vak, the sacred speech, as Prithvi, the earth, began to be understood in more unified ways, as Shakti, as Devi, as the divine feminine principle that was not subordinate to the masculine but essential, the power without which even the greatest gods could not act. This was a slow emergence happening across different regions with different emphases. In some areas, the goddess traditions remained local and distinct. In others, they began to coalesce into pan-Indian forms, but the recognition of divine feminine power as fundamental to the cosmos was growing, deepening, preparing the ground for later developments. The period between the composition of the early Upanishads and the beginning of the Common Era was one of remarkable ferment. Buddhism and Jainism emerged during this time, offering alternative paths, challenging certain Vedic assumptions while accepting others, and the tradition that would come to be called Hinduism responded with its own creativity, its own evolution. The gods were not static figures. They were living presences in the imagination and devotion of countless people, and they grew, changed, absorbed influences, merged with local deities, took on regional characteristics, became simultaneously more universal and more particular, more philosophical and more accessible, more abstract and more personal. By the time the Common Era began, the foundations were in place for the great flooring that would come. The epics were being composed. The Puranas were beginning to take shape. New forms of devotion were emerging, and the gods of the Hindu tradition were ready to enter their classical period, their time of fullest elaboration and most magnificent storytelling. But that development belonged to the future. For now, in this early period, the essential patterns had been established, the questions had been asked, the paths had been marked, and the divine beings who would walk those paths with humanity for thousands of years to come had begun to reveal their natures, their stories, their inexhaustible capacity to meet human longing with forms both terrible and beautiful, both familiar and utterly beyond comprehension. The great turning came with the epics, those massive narrative oceans that would shape the religious imagination of the subcontinent for millennia, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Texts so vast and so embedded in cultural consciousness that they ceased to be merely stories and became something more like shared dreams, collective memories of a time when gods walked among mortals and every action carried cosmic weight. The Mahabharata, attributed to the sage Vyasa, grew over centuries through oral transmission and gradual accretion until it reached a length of some 100,000 verses, making it perhaps the longest poem ever composed, a work so encyclopedic that it contains within itself philosophies and myths and genealogies and legal discussions and romantic interludes and battlefield descriptions of stunning brutality. At its heart lies a family conflict, a war between cousins, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, fighting for control of a kingdom. But this human drama unfolds against a backdrop of divine intervention, because the Pandavas are themselves semi-divine, born through blessings to mothers whose husbands could not produce heirs, Yudhishthira, son of Dharma itself, Bhima, son of the wind god, Arjuna, son of Indra, and the twins Nakula and Sahadeva, sons of the celestial horsemen. And most crucially, their companion and charioteer is Krishna, who appears first as a prince, a cowherd, a political advisor, a friend, but who reveals himself at the pivotal moment before battle as something infinitely greater, as Vishnu incarnate, as the Supreme Lord who contains all the gods within himself, all the worlds, all of time past and future. This revelation comes in the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of the Lord, that section of the epic that has become perhaps the most beloved and most commented upon text in the entire tradition. 700 verses of dialogue between Arjuna and Krishna on the battlefield, on the cusp of a war that will destroy most of the warriors assembled there. Arjuna falters, seeing his teachers and relatives and friends arrayed on both sides, recognizing that victory will require killing those he loves, and he lays down his weapons, refuses to fight, asks how such slaughter could ever be justified. And Krishna responds not with simple reassurance, but with teachings that unfold layer by layer, first addressing Arjuna's immediate concern, explaining that the soul is eternal, that bodies are merely garments changed from life to life, that the wise grieve neither for the living nor the dead because they understand the imperishable nature of the self. But the discourse deepens, expands. Krishna describes the path of selfless action, performing one's duty without attachment to results, acting in the world while remaining internally free. This is karma yoga, the way of engagement without bondage, of participation without entanglement. And then he speaks of devotion, of bhakti, of the path of loving surrender to the divine, describing how even those who cannot master meditation or renunciation can reach the highest goal through simple, heartfelt worship, through offering flowers or water or even a leaf with sincere devotion, because what matters is not the grandeur of the offering, but the love with which it is given. And finally, when Arjuna asks to see Krishna's true form, the text describes a theophany, a vision of the cosmic form, the Vishvarupa, in which Arjuna perceives all of existence within Krishna's body, sees past and present and future simultaneously, sees gods and demons and humans being swallowed by time's inexorable flow, sees the entire universe as Krishna's play, his Leela, his dance of creation and dissolution. The description is overwhelming, terrifying, and beautiful at once. Arjuna sees Krishna as the source of all, as time itself devouring the worlds, as the beginning and middle and end of all beings, and he trembles, asks to see again the familiar gentle form of his friend, because the cosmic vision is more than human consciousness can bear for long. This text, this dialogue, introduced ideas that would reshape devotional practice throughout the tradition, the notion that God could be approached as friend, as beloved, as intimate companion rather than merely as distant transcendent reality. The idea that grace mattered more than ritual precision, that sincerity counted more than birth or learning. Krishna himself became the focus of intense devotional movements, his childhood stories elaborated in the Puranas, tales of the divine infant stealing butter, lifting mountains to protect cowherds from storms, dancing on the heads of serpents, playing his flute in the forests of Vrindavan, while the gopis, the cowherd women, abandon their duties to dance with him in the moonlight. These stories of Krishna's youthful exploits, his ras leela, his circular dance of divine love, became potent symbols of the soul's longing for union with the divine. The gopis elicit love for Krishna read as metaphor for the way spiritual seekers must abandon worldly attachments, must risk everything, must transgress ordinary dharma itself in pursuit of the highest truth. And alongside Krishna, the other avatar stories multiplied. Vishnu's descent as Ramas in the Ramayana, that other great epic, the tale of the prince exiled from his kingdom through palace intrigue, wandering the forests with his wife Sita and brother Lakshmana, facing the demon king Ravana who abducts Sita, building an army of monkeys and bears to cross the ocean to Lanka and rescue her. The Ramayana, attributed to the poet Valmiki, presents Rama as the ideal king, the perfect son, the devoted husband, Dharma embodied in human form, his story unfolding with a tragic grandeur, because even divine incarnations must suffer in the world of samsara, must face impossible choices and endure separation and loss. Sita herself becomes a model of virtue. Though later interpreters would struggle with aspects of her story, her trial by fire to prove her purity after rescue, her eventual abandonment by Rama due to public gossip, the text itself seems to recognize these tensions, these moments where Dharma demands cruelty, where righteousness requires sacrifice that feels unjust. But Rama's story also includes moments of profound devotion, particularly in the figure of Hanuman, the monkey god who serves Rama with absolute loyalty, who leaps across the ocean in a single bound, who carries mountains with healing herbs, who tears open his chest to show Rama and Sita enthroned in his heart. Hanuman became the exemplar of bhakti, of devotion so complete that it transcends all obstacles, so powerful that it grants superhuman strength and courage. These epics circulated through performance, through recitation, through traveling bards who would spend weeks or months telling the stories in villages across the subcontinent, and the gods within them became familiar presences, known intimately through repeated encounter, their personalities and preferences and stories woven into the fabric of daily life. And then came the Puranas, 18 major texts and numerous minor ones, encyclopedias of mythology and cosmology and genealogy, each Purana associated with one of the great gods, the Vishnu Purana, the Shiva Purana, the Devi Bhagavata Purana, texts that elaborated the myths hinted at in earlier sources, that created vast narrative universes around each deity. The Puranas describe the cycles of creation and dissolution, the kalpas and yugas, vast time periods that make human history seem like the blink of an eye. They describe how Brahma creates the universe from a lotus growing from Vishnu's navel, how that universe exists for billions of years before dissolving back into the cosmic ocean, how this cycle repeats endlessly, creation and destruction as the breath of the divine. They tell the story of the churning of the milk ocean, how gods and demons worked together to extract the nectar of immortality, how Vishnu took the form of a beautiful woman to distract the demons while the gods drank the Amrita, how various treasures emerged from the churning, including Lakshmi herself, rising from the waters on a lotus, choosing Vishnu as her consort. They elaborate Shiva's mythology, his marriage to Sati, who immolates herself when her father insults her husband, Shiva's grief so intense that he carries her corpse across the world in a dance of mourning, her body parts falling to earth and becoming sacred sites, and then her rebirth as Parvati, the daughter of the mountains, who wins Shiva through devoted practice, through tapas, the ascetic heat that generates spiritual power. The Puranas describe Shiva's cosmic dance, the Tandava, performed in the hall with 1,000 pillars, his dance that creates and destroys the universe, his drum marking time, his hand raised in the gesture of fearlessness, his foot crushing the demon of ignorance, the circle of flames surrounding him representing the cycle of birth and death, this image becoming one of the most iconic in the entire tradition. They tell of Ganesha's birth, created by Parvati from the dirt of her own body, set to guard her door while she bathed, beheaded by Shiva, who did not recognize him, and then restored to life with an elephant's head, becoming the remover of obstacles, the lord of beginnings, the patron of writers and merchants, and anyone embarking on new endeavors. They describe the goddess in her many forms as Durga, riding a lion, created from the combined energies of all the gods to defeat the buffalo demon Mahishasura, who could not be killed by any male being, as Kali dancing on battlefields, wearing a garland of skulls, her tongue extended, fierce and terrible, yet also the loving mother who protects her devotees, as Saraswati in white garments, holding the veena, seated on a lotus or a swan, embodying the flow of knowledge and artistic inspiration. These texts also systematize the practice of puja, the ritual worship that became central to Hindu devotional life, describing how to establish images in temples, how to invoke the deity's presence, how to offer flowers and incense and food, how to perform circumambulation, how to receive prasad, the blessed food that has been offered to and accepted by the god. The temple itself became understood as a cosmic diagram, a three-dimensional mandala, its architecture encoding philosophical and cosmological principles, the central shrine representing the cave of the heart, where the divine dwells, the towering superstructure symbolizing the sacred mountain, the circumambulatory path allowing devotees to honor the deity by walking around the sacred space. And different regions developed their own styles, the Nagara temples of the north with their curving towers, the Dravida temples of the south with their gopurams, gateway towers covered in sculpted figures, rising tier upon tier, entire cities built around temple complexes that became centers of learning and art and economic life. The gods enshrined in these temples were treated as royal persons, awakened in the morning, bathed and dressed, offered meals throughout the day, entertained with music and dance, put to bed at night. The ritualists, understanding that the infinite formless Brahman had graciously consented to dwell in the image, had accepted limitation out of compassion, making the divine accessible to those who needed form and presence. And alongside the grand temples, countless small shrines, roadside stones smeared with vermilion, trees wrapped in sacred thread, every village with its local manifestations of the great gods, its Gramadevata, its protective spirits and ancestors who might be fierce or benign, who required propitiation and respect, who mediated between the cosmic deities and everyday concerns. The philosophical schools also flourished during these centuries. Vedanta, in various forms, interpreting the Upanishads and the Brahma Sutras and the Gita in different ways. Shankara, teaching absolute non-dualism, that only Brahman is real and the world is Maya, appearance, superimposition like the snake mistaken for a rope in dim light. Ramanuja, teaching a qualified non-dualism, that souls and the world are real but dependent on Brahman, like waves are real manifestations of the ocean, not separate, but also not merely illusory. His philosophy supporting devotional practice by affirming the reality of the personal God worthy of love and worship. Madhva teaching dualism, eternal distinction between God and souls, between the Creator and creation, 5 fundamental differences that are never overcome even in liberation. His vision preserving the devotional relationship while granting souls their own intrinsic reality, and the tantric traditions emerging, working with the body as a site of transformation, with kundalini energy rising through the chakras, with mantras and yantras and complex ritual practices, understanding the goddess as Shakti, the dynamic power that activates Shiva's static consciousness, the two eternally joined in the generative tension that produces all manifestation. These centuries saw an explosion of devotional poetry in regional languages, Tamil, Bengali, Marathi, Hindi, the saints singing of their love for Krishna or Rama or Shiva, Mirabai abandoning her royal status to wander as a devotee, Tulsidas retelling the Ramayana in a vernacular that made it accessible to those without Sanskrit, Kabir weaving together Hindu and Muslim imagery in verses that challenged orthodoxy and sectarian division. The gods became companions in this devotional outpouring, Krishna addressed as friend, as child, as lover, Rama revered as the perfect Lord worthy of service. Shiva approached through ecstatic identification, the devotees often describing states of possession, of merger, of love so intense it dissolved the boundaries of self. And as centuries passed into centuries, as empires rose and fell across the subcontinent, as languages evolved and arts flourished, and philosophies debated in temple courtyards and forest hermitages, the gods continued their own evolution, responding to new contexts, new questions, new longings in the hearts of those who called upon them. The medieval period brought waves of political change, sultanates, and then the Mughal Empire establishing Islamic rule over much of the subcontinent, and the Hindu tradition responded not with uniformity, but with its characteristic multiplicity, some communities maintaining practices unchanged, others adapting, still others creating new syntheses that drew from multiple sources. The Bhakti movement intensified during these centuries, spreading across regions, crossing caste boundaries, challenging Brahminical authority through the radical claim that devotion mattered more than birth or learning, that a low-caste leather worker or a woman poet could achieve union with the divine through love alone, without elaborate rituals or scholarly knowledge of Sanskrit texts. The saints of this movement came from every stratum of society. Namdev the tailor, Kabir the weaver, Ravidas the cobbler, their songs declaring that the divine dwelt not in temples alone, but in the heart of every sincere seeker, that external observances meant nothing without internal transformation, that the same truth could be called Krishna or Allah, Rama or Rahim, names pointing toward a reality beyond all naming. Chaitanya in Bengal danced through the streets in ecstatic devotion to Krishna, creating a movement that emphasized congregational singing, kirtan, the collective raising of voices in praise. his followers developing sophisticated theologies around the relationship between Krishna and the devotee, mapping the stages of love from initial attraction through deepening intimacy toward the ultimate union that preserves distinction even in merger. The Alvars and Nayanars in the Tamil South had pioneered this devotional intensity centuries earlier, singing in the vernacular, visiting temple after temple, their songs collected into sacred canons, the Nalayira Divya Prabandham for the Vaishnavas, the Tevaram for the Shaivas, texts that rivaled the Vedas in devotional authority, that demonstrated the power of love expressed in human languages rather than Sanskrit alone, and the goddess traditions flourished with particular intensity. The Devi Mahatmya, recounting how Durga slew Mahishasura, how Kali emerged from Durga's forehead to destroy demons, how the goddess in her various forms protected the cosmos when the gods themselves proved insufficient. These narratives affirming feminine divine power as supreme, as the source from which even the great male gods derived their efficacy. The Shakta Tantras describe the goddess as the ultimate reality, Shiva without Shakti reduced to a corpse, powerless, inert. Only through union with the feminine principle could consciousness actualize its creative potential. This theological vision supporting goddess worship as the highest path, Devi not as consort, but as the supreme deity herself. Regional forms of the goddess proliferated. Kali worshipped in Bengal with intense devotion, Ramakrishna in the 19th century spending hours in her temple, falling into trances, experiencing visions, teaching that all religions led to the same truth, but choosing to approach that truth through the form of the Divine Mother, his disciple Vivekananda, carrying this message to the West, introducing Hindu philosophy to audiences who had known nothing of it. The colonial period brought new challenges and transformations. British rule, imposing foreign categories on Hindu traditions, administrators attempting to codify laws, to systematize practices, to understand through their own frameworks a tradition that had always resisted singular definition. Hindu intellectuals responded variously, some internalizing colonial critiques, attempting to reform practices seen as backward, opposing child marriage, promoting widow remarriage, questioning caste discrimination, often drawing on ancient texts to argue that contemporary practices had deviated from original purity. Others asserted continuity and value, defending practices as expressions of profound philosophical truths misunderstood by outsiders, arguing that the tradition's diversity and tolerance exceeded anything found in Christianity or Islam. That idol worship reflected sophisticated understanding of the formless manifesting through form. The gods themselves became contested symbols, reformers sometimes arguing for a more abstract monotheism, suggesting that worship of multiple deities represented primitive superstition that educated Hindus should transcend, while traditionalists insisted on the validity of polytheistic practice, on the reality of the gods as distinct personalities worthy of devotion. Gandhi drew on the tradition selectively, using the concept of ahimsa, nonviolence, as a political weapon against colonial rule, reading the Gita as a text about spiritual struggle rather than literal warfare, his interpretation innovative yet presented as recovery of authentic meaning, the text's flexibility allowing for this creative reappropriation. He also elevated the figure of Rama, using the name Ram Raja, Rama's kingdom, to describe the ideal society he hoped independent India would become, though his vision emphasized justice and equality in ways that went beyond traditional interpretations. Rama reimagined as symbol of righteous governance rather than simply royal authority. Independence brought new questions about the relationship between religious tradition and modern nation-state, the secular constitution protecting religious freedom, while many continued to see Indian identity as fundamentally Hindu, the gods invoked in political rhetoric, temples becoming sites where national and religious identities merged and sometimes clashed. The 20th century also saw Hindu traditions spreading beyond the subcontinent through migration and missionary activity, yoga traveling to the West, first in rarefied forms taught by swamis to small groups of seekers, then gradually popularized, adapted, separated from its religious context, and repackaged as wellness practice, as fitness routine, as stress management technique. Meditation practices followed similar trajectories. Transcendental meditation offering mantras stripped of their devotional meanings. Mindfulness drawing on Buddhist sources but finding ready adoption among those familiar with Hindu contemplative traditions. The boundaries between traditions blurring in diaspora contexts. The gods themselves acquired new forms and contexts. Krishna and Ganesha appearing on posters in college dorm rooms, their images aestheticized, commodified, divorced from ritual practice, yet still somehow carrying resonance, still pointing towards something seekers found meaningful even when translated into utterly foreign settings. ISKCON, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, established temples around the world, introducing Westerners to ecstatic devotion, to kirtan and prasad, and the philosophy of Chaitanya's lineage, their translation of the Bhagavad Gita spreading widely, becoming for many their first encounter with Hindu texts. Though traditionalists sometimes question the movement's innovations and evangelistic approach, Hindu communities in diaspora built temples that became cultural centers, places where immigrant families could maintain connections to tradition, where children could learn languages and stories and practices their parents feared might otherwise be lost. The gods presiding over community gatherings that were simultaneously religious and social, devotional and ethnic, and back in India, the tradition continued its internal debates and developments, new gurus arising, some controversial, some revered, all claiming to offer authentic paths, while often innovating freely, combining traditional elements in novel ways, using modern media to spread their messages, attracting followers who might seek spiritual guidance while remaining skeptical of institutional religion. The gods appeared in new media, in calendar art, in comic books, in television serials that became cultural phenomena, entire communities gathering to watch episodes of the Ramayana or Mahabharata, the gods' stories told through these modern forms, reaching audiences far larger than any temple ritual or scripture recitation could access. Films explored mythological themes, sometimes reverently, sometimes playfully, sometimes controversially. The gods, as characters in narratives that might affirm tradition or question it, that might present them as literal beings or as psychological symbols. The interpretive possibilities as multiple as the tradition itself, and philosophical explorations continued, scholars and practitioners debating the meaning of ancient texts, producing new commentaries on the Upanishads and Gita, arguing about whether Vedanta pointed toward non-dualism or theism or something that escaped these categories altogether. the tradition's intellectual vitality undiminished by modernity's challenges. The environmental movement found resources in Hindu traditions, ideas of the earth as goddess, of rivers as sacred, of trees as worthy of reverence. These concepts deployed in conservation efforts used to argue for environmental protection on religious grounds, though critics noted the gap between ideals and practices, between reverence for nature in principle and its exploitation in fact. Feminist scholars grappled with the tradition's complex legacy, finding empowerment in goddess worship, yet also critiquing patriarchal structures, celebrating Sita and Draupadi, yet questioning the constraints imposed on women in their names, recovering forgotten female saints and philosophers, while challenging interpretations that subordinated women, the goddesses themselves becoming sites of contested meaning. And through all these transformations, through colonialism and independence, through diaspora and globalization, through modernization and its discontents, the gods remained, not unchanged, never unchanged, but continuous, recognizable, their stories still told, their names still invoked, their images still venerated in temples, ancient and newly built, in homes and roadside shrines, in the inner sanctums of hearts, still seeking meaning through forms inherited from countless generations. The tradition that had begun with Vedic hymns beside ritual fires had become something vast and varied beyond any simple description, encompassing philosophy and devotion, ritual and meditation, social structures and personal quests. Inclusive of countless local variations and sectarian distinctions, yet somehow also unified by shared stories and symbols and practices. To speak of the gods of Hinduism in the singular was to falsify through oversimplification, yet to catalog every regional form and theological interpretation would be to drown in detail without grasping the patterns, the family resemblances, the themes that recurred across contexts. These were gods who created and destroyed, who descended and withdrew, who demanded sacrifice, yet also granted grace freely, who embodied contradictions without being contradictory, who were one and many simultaneously, who were ultimate reality and also personalities with preferences and moods, who transcended all form yet welcomed worship through images, who had existed forever yet also manifested in historical time. And perhaps this multiplicity, this refusal of singular definition, this comfort with paradox and plurality, was itself the deepest truth the tradition offered. Not a bug, but a feature, not confusion, but sophistication, a recognition that the infinite could not be captured in any single formulation, that the divine necessarily appeared differently to different seekers in different circumstances. That truth itself was too large for uniformity. The gods had journeyed far from those Vedic fire altars, yet they remained connected to them. The hymns still chanted, the rituals still performed, the questions still asked. Continuity and change braided together like the Ganges and Yamuna at their confluence, distinct yet flowing together toward an ocean that contained them both. The deepening quiet of contemplation draws the mind toward patterns, toward the shapes that emerge when stepping back from individual stories, from particular deities, toward the underlying currents that flow through thousands of years of devotion and speculation. There is a quality to these gods that resists the categories often applied to them. To call them merely metaphors feels reductive, as if those who prostrated before their images or sang their names were engaged in some elaborate misunderstanding. Yet to insist on their literal objective existence in the way a mountain exists also misses something essential, some flexibility, some creative interplay between the divine and the devotee that makes the relationship more dynamic than simple realism allows. The tradition itself seems comfortable with this ambiguity, with affirming that the gods are real, while also explaining them as aspects of Brahman, as Maya, as Lala, as play and illusion and manifestation all at once, the philosophical and the devotional held together without requiring resolution into singular truth. Consider the concept of Ista Devata, the chosen deity, the recognition that different practitioners might focus devotion on different gods, not because one is true and others false, but because different personalities resonate with different aspects of the infinite. Some drawn to Shiva's asceticism, others to Krishna's playfulness, still others to the fierce protection of Kali, each valid, each offering a genuine path, the diversity celebrated rather than suppressed. Or consider the narratives themselves, the way stories contradict without anxiety. Ganesha's birth told differently in different texts. The goddess described as Shiva's wife in some contexts and as the supreme power from which he emerges in others, the chronology impossible to reconcile if treated as history, yet perfectly coherent as mythology, as truth expressed through story rather than through chronicle. The gods teach through their contradictions. Shiva, the ascetic, who is also the householder, the destroyer who preserves through destroying, the master of yoga who dances in ecstatic abandon. These are not flaws in the characterization, but invitations to deeper understanding, to recognizing that ultimate reality cannot be confined to comfortable categories, that the divine necessarily exceeds human logic, and the avatars of Vishnu encode a cosmological vision, the progression from fish to tortoise to boar, to man-lion to dwarf to warrior, sometimes read as evolutionary sequence, sometimes as myth cycle, always as demonstration that the divine takes whatever form is needed, that there is no situation so desperate, no crisis so severe that intervention cannot come, even if it comes in unexpected guise. The goddess traditions perhaps probe most deeply into paradox. Kali dancing on Shiva's corpse, yet also the nurturing mother. Durga created by the gods, yet superior to them. Saraswati's gentle wisdom and Kali's fierce destruction understood as aspects of single feminine principle. The tradition refusing to separate the creative and destructive, the beautiful and terrible, insisting they are inseparable, that life feeds on death, that creation requires destruction, that the mother who gives life also takes it away. There is also the question of darshan, the seeing and being seen by the deity. This practice that makes temple worship not about asking favors or performing obligations, but about encountering presence, about standing before the image and allowing oneself to be beheld, to be known, the eyes of the god, meeting the eyes of the devotee in an exchange that is somehow mutual, despite the vast disparity in being and the festivals that punctuate the year. Diwali's lights welcoming Lakshmi, Navaratri's 9 nights honoring the goddess, Holi's colors celebrating Krishna's play, Mahashivaratri's vigil of fasting and meditation, these rhythms connecting communities, marking time not just chronologically, but mythologically, allowing participants to enter sacred time, to reenact cosmic events, to align their lives with divine patterns. The practice of mantra carries its own depths. The repetition of names, of syllables, of entire hymns, the sound itself considered powerful, transformative, the vibration altering consciousness, not through meaning alone, but through resonance, through the physical experience of speaking or hearing sacred speech. Om Namah Shivaya, Hare Krishna, Om Aim Sarasvatyai Namah. Each formula a key opening particular doors, invoking particular presences, and the sacred geography that maps the divine onto landscape, the 7 sacred cities, the 12 Jyotirlingas, the 51 Shakti Pithas, pilgrimage routes connecting these sites, millions walking for days or weeks to bathe in rivers made holy by mythological events, to climb mountains where gods meditated, to circumambulate temples that mark where the divine touched earth, the land itself sacralized through story, every rock and river potentially the site of ancient events, of ongoing presence. The arts too become vehicles for the divine. Classical dance depicting stories of Krishna and Shiva, each gesture codified, each movement laden with meaning, the dancer not performing about the gods, but embodying them, becoming for the duration of the dance a living icon, music as devotion, ragas as offerings, the boundaries between aesthetic experience and religious practice dissolving, and always the texts, the endless production of commentaries and poems and philosophical treatises, each generation adding to the conversation, interpreting, reinterpreting, finding new meanings in ancient words, the tradition alive because it continues to generate thought, to provoke questions, to demand engagement rather than passive acceptance. Perhaps what distinguishes this pantheon is its refusal of finality, its comfort with ongoing elaboration, with regional variations and sectarian developments that splinter and recombine without destroying underlying unity, the way Hinduism encompasses rather than excludes, how it absorbs local deities into larger frameworks, how it allows for both monotheism and polytheism, both personal God and impersonal absolute, both this worldly engagement and renunciation, the capacity to hold contradictions not as problems to solve, but as truths to honor. The gods remain inexhaustible. After thousands of years, after countless stories and songs and philosophical analyses, they still generate new meanings, still speak to contemporary concerns, still offer forms through which the formless can be approached, still invite the devotion and contemplation and creative engagement that keeps tradition living rather than merely preserved. And so the journey through these divine presences begins to curve back toward stillness, toward the quiet from which it emerged, the stories told, the patterns observed, the questions raised and left hanging in the air like incense, smoke drifting upward. The gods of the Hindu tradition are not artifacts, not relics of a superseded worldview. They are living realities for hundreds of millions, presences invoked daily in temples and homes, in moments of crisis and moments of celebration, their names on the lips of the dying and the newborn, woven so deeply into culture and consciousness that to extract them would be to unravel the entire fabric. Yet they are also more than communal heritage, more than ethnic tradition. They are explorations of the possible relationships between human and divine, between finite and infinite, between the urgency of embodied life and the peace of transcendence. Each god a different question, a different answer, a different path up the mountain that all paths climb. to have spent this time in their presence, to have followed their evolution from Vedic hymns, through epic narratives, through devotional movements, through modern reinterpretations, is to have traced one of humanity's longest continuous conversations, one of our most sustained attempts to give form to the formless, to make the infinite intimate, to bridge the chasm between the mortal and the eternal. The images remain: Vishnu on his serpent, Shiva in meditation, Ganesha with his broken tusk, Durga on her lion, Krishna with his flute, each one a doorway, an invitation, a promise that the divine can be known, not fully, never fully, but genuinely, that grace flows toward those who seek, that presence answers the call of longing. And perhaps in the end, what these gods offer is not solutions, but companionship, not answers, but deepening questions, not escape from the human condition, but sacred interpretation of it. They suffer and love and create and destroy alongside those who worship them. They are both utterly other and strangely familiar, both far beyond and somehow near. The temple bells ring at dusk. The arati flames circle before the images. Voices rise in ancient Sanskrit and contemporary vernaculars. And for a moment, the boundaries thin between past and present, between myth and history, between the world as it is and the world as it might be if the divine truly dwelt within it. The Ganges continues its flow. The mountains stand in their eternal patience. The stories are told again to children who will tell them to their children. And the gods remain, shifting, evolving, responding to new devotions and new doubts, as inexhaustible as the human capacity for wonder, as enduring as the questions that wake us in the darkness and follow us into light. The narratives could continue forever. Each god has 1,000 names, each name a story, each story branching into others, the traditions structured like a fractal, the same patterns repeating at every scale, infinity contained in finite forms, the many and the one engaged in eternal conversation. But there is also value in silence, in allowing the words to slow, to space themselves further apart, to recognize that some truths live in the pauses between statements, in the resonance that lingers after the bell has been struck, in the darkness beyond the circle of firelight, where something immense and ancient breathes with patience that makes human time seem like the flutter of leaves. The gods have been generous, sharing their stories, allowing themselves to be discussed and analyzed and contemplated, but they are not exhausted by this attention. They remain, always more to discover, always depths unplumbed, always new aspects to reveal to those who seek with sincerity and devotion. And so the story finds its end, though not conclusion, because these gods have no conclusion. They continue in temples and hearts, in texts being studied and rituals being performed, in questions being asked by new generations, in the eternal return of seasons and festivals, in the ongoing dialogue between the human and the divine. The mist rises from the river, the shapes within it becoming indistinct, fading back into formlessness, but not disappearing, never disappearing, only withdrawing, waiting, ready to manifest again when called upon, when needed, when devotion creates the space for presence. The journey completes, the circle closes, the telling rests, and in the stillness that follows, perhaps something remains, some residue of wonder, some echo of the infinite, some recognition that these gods, in all their multiplicity and contradiction, point toward a reality that exceeds all naming, all knowing, all telling, and the final words drift away like smoke, like morning mist, like prayers carried on the wind, toward mountains where gods have meditated since before time began, dissolving into silence, into peace, into the vast and gentle darkness where all stories begin, and to which all stories, in the end, return.